Pretend to be my wife for 2 weeks. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago knelt on one knee before the bakery girl at 10 o'clock at night. The reason she couldn't speak left her completely wordless. But to understand why the man the entire city feared was willing to do something that insane, we have to go back 5 days earlier, to a drawing made with colored pencils. Why does my picture only have 2 people? Zoe's voice trembled as she stared down at her paper. All the other kids in class had drawn 3 people. The preschool teacher knelt beside her. Around the room, other children proudly held up their family pictures, with a dad, with a mom, with brothers and sisters. But Zoe's sheet of paper had only 2 stick figures standing side by side. Every family is different, sweetheart. Some families have 2 people, some have more. But Zoe shook her head, her tiny hand gripping a red-colored pencil so hard her knuckles turned white. But someone asked me, "Where's your mom?" And I said, "I don't know." That afternoon, a black armored SUV stopped in front of the school gate. The car door opened. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, a faint scar running along the left side of his jaw, gray eyes cold as steel. Elijah Ashford, the kind of man who, when he walked, the sidewalk emptied on its own. But the teacher was already waiting at the door, and she didn't look at him. She looked into the corner of the room, where Zoe sat curled up by herself, clutching her princess backpack, her big brown eyes red and watery. "Mr. Ashford, Zoe had a very hard day. We need to talk." Elijah looked at his daughter, his jaw clenched. He nodded, lifted Zoe into his arms without saying a single word. The little girl wrapped her arms around his neck, her face pressed into his shoulder, light as air, so small, as if the whole world was resting on the shoulders of a child nearly 4 years old. Brennan, his trusted bodyguard, opened the car door. On the way back to the mansion, Zoe sat in silence, staring out the window, her hand pressing the crumpled drawing tight against her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She was only silent. A silence more frightening than any sob. Brennan glanced into the rearview mirror, then quietly turned his face away. He'd seen enough brutality in his life, but the silence of a 3-year-old was something he couldn't take. Then, all at once, a tiny sentence rose in the middle of the car, soft as breath, but heavy as a hammer. "Daddy, Mom left because I'm a bad kid, didn't she?" The car went dead still. Brennan instinctively hit the brakes, and Elijah, whose hands had never shaken on a trigger, whose hands had signed orders that made the entire underworld of Chicago bow its head, was now trembling as he took his daughter's little hand. He turned to look at Zoe, and for the first time in his life, the undisputed king of the underground didn't know what to say. If Zoe's words just made your throat tighten, hit like, "Because every child deserves to be loved." Share this story with someone who needs to hear that love doesn't just happen, it's a choice you make every day. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next story will make you cry even more. Elijah couldn't breathe. Zoe's question hit him like a bullet straight through the chest, more precise than any gunshot he'd ever taken in his life. He looked at his daughter's big brown eyes in the rearview mirror, eyes waiting for an answer he didn't have. "Brennan, pull over." His voice came out rough and raw. Brennan didn't ask why. His hands moved smoothly on the wheel, guiding the SUV to the side of the road. Elijah unbuckled his seatbelt, turned toward the back seat, and pulled Zoe into his arms. She was weightless, so small that he could wrap her entire body in a single embrace. He held her tight, his chin resting on the crown of her head, breathing in the strawberry-scented baby shampoo he bought every month but had never quite managed to use properly on her himself. "Listen to me. You're not bad. You've never been bad. You're the most perfect thing I've ever had in this life." Zoe didn't push him away, but she didn't hug him back either. She sat still in his arms, the crumpled drawing still trapped between her tiny hands. "Then why did Mom leave, Daddy?" Elijah closed his eyes, and the memories came crashing down like a black waterfall, 3.5 years earlier. This mansion had been just as cold then as it was now, but there had been another woman in it. Vanessa. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a smile Elijah once believed would be the last thing he saw every night before sleep. But Vanessa stopped smiling from the night she found bloodstains on the concrete floor of the storage room behind the mansion. From the night she heard gunshots echo from the basement at 3 o'clock in the morning. From the night Marco Salerno sent an envelope, inside it a photograph of Vanessa pushing Zoe's stroller in the park, with a single line of messy handwritten words beneath it. "Leave, or the baby will pay the price for you." Vanessa never told Elijah about that photograph. She didn't tell him because she knew Elijah would answer with violence, and violence would breed more violence, and their 6-month-old daughter would grow up in a battlefield. So one November morning, while Elijah went out to work and Zoe slept in her crib, Vanessa placed a letter on his pillow, kissed her daughter's forehead one last time, and disappeared. The letter had only 2 lines. I have to leave so she can be safe. Don't look for me. Elijah looked. Of course he did. He tore through all of Chicago, called in every contact, put up rewards, made threats, kicked down doors, but Vanessa vanished as if she'd never existed. It took 3 months before he found Marco's photograph hidden in the bedside drawer Vanessa always kept locked. And then he understood. His wife hadn't left because she didn't love their child. She left because she loved her too much. Because the world Elijah had built was too dangerous for a newborn. Because he was the reason, and he knew that better than anyone. But what could he tell Zoe now? That her mother had been threatened with death by his enemies. That her mother ran because her father was the kind of man people ran from. That he was the reason she didn't have a mother. Zoe was only 3. She believed princesses were always rescued, and that her father was the strongest man in the world. He couldn't tell her the truth, because the truth would destroy the only image of him his daughter had left. Sometimes adults have to leave for very complicated reasons, princess. Reasons even Daddy can't explain. But I promise you, Mom didn't leave because you were bad. She left because she thought it was the best way to keep you safe. Zoe lifted her face to look at him. Her eyes were still red, but there was something else in them now. Something a 3-year-old shouldn't have. Doubt. Is Mom coming back, Daddy? Elijah stayed silent. Brennan glanced into the rearview mirror, then turned his face away. Outside the window, Chicago slid backward, gray and indifferent, and inside the mobile fortress worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, the man who ruled Chicago's shadows couldn't find a single answer for his daughter that wasn't a lie. The SUV stopped in front of the iron gate of the Lincoln Park mansion. 2 layers of security cameras swept over the vehicle before the gate slowly opened. Brennan drove through the wide courtyard, where 2 guards in black suits nodded in greeting, and then returned to their posts. Elijah lifted Zoe out of the car. She still clutched the crumpled drawing to her chest, her eyes dry now but swollen. The front door opened, and they stepped into the house Elijah called home, even though it had never truly been a home. The living room was vast, with a ceiling nearly 16 feet high, a crystal chandelier, Italian leather sofas, and an oak table polished until it reflected the face of whoever sat there. Everything was expensive, everything was flawless, and everything was cold down to the bone. Not a single family photo on the walls, not a single childish scribble taped to the refrigerator. No laughter, no smell of baking, nothing that said a 3-year-old was growing up here. This house felt more like a fortress than a warm nest, and Elijah knew it, but he didn't know how to change it. He knew how to build an empire, how to make enemies kneel, how to make more money than 3 generations could spend. But he didn't know how to turn these 4 freezing walls into a place his daughter wanted to run back to every day. Elijah set Zoe down on the living room floor. She stood there for a moment, looking around the empty space, then quietly walked to the corner where her box of colored pencils sat beside her sketch pad. Zoe sat on the icy marble floor, opened the box, and began to draw. Elijah watched from a distance. He wanted to come closer, but he didn't know what else to say. Whatever comfort he had to give had already run out in that SUV. He stepped back into the kitchen, told the housekeeper to prepare dinner for Zoe, and when he returned, his daughter was still in the same spot, bent over her paper with a focus no 3-year-old should have to carry. He moved closer and knelt beside her, and he saw the drawing. This time it wasn't 2 stick figures, it was 3. The smallest one stood in the middle, with 2 pigtails sketched in messy little lines. The tall figure on the left had no hair. That was Daddy. And on the right was the 3rd figure, taller than Zoe but shorter than Daddy, with long hair brushing the shoulders, wearing a purple dress and red shoes. Elijah stared at it, and his heart tightened. "Who is this, Princess?" Zoe didn't look up. She kept coloring the shoes red. "This is the mom I want to have. This mom has long hair so she can braid my hair. This mom wears a purple dress because purple is my favorite color. This mom wears red shoes because red shoes are the prettiest." She said it in a calm voice, as if she were describing a cartoon character, not sketching the mother she had been yearning for since the day she became aware of what was missing. Elijah swallowed hard. "It's a beautiful picture." "Daddy." Zoe set the pencil down and turned to look at him. Her big brown eyes were the same as his, but there was something in them his eyes didn't have. Hope. Hope so fragile it would shatter if you touched it. How many days until my birthday? 5 days, princess. You asked me what present I wanted. I remember. What do you want? Zoe took a deep breath, as if she were getting ready to say something huge, something important, something she'd been thinking about for days but hadn't dared to speak out loud. I want a mom at my birthday party. Elijah didn't move. All my friends have a dad and a mom who come. Megan has a mom who makes the birthday cake. Tyler has a mom who braids hair really pretty. Olivia has a mom who sings the birthday song the best in class. And I only have daddy. Zoe's voice wasn't accusing. It was worse than that. It was accepting, resigned, as if having only daddy was something she'd gotten used to, but something that still hurt every single day. I want a mom to braid my hair every morning, to sing to me before I sleep, to hug me when I have nightmares instead of daddy having to carry me into daddy's room. Tears began to roll down Zoe's cheeks, but she didn't wail. She cried the way children do when they're used to being sad, quietly, without demanding attention, letting the tears fall, and then wiping them away on their own. It's not fair, Daddy. Elijah pulled her into his arms. Zoe pressed her face to his chest, and at last she cried out loud, a small sound, choked and trembling. He held her with both arms, hands that had crushed enemies' faces, hands that had closed around traitors' throats, now shaking as they stroked the hair of his 3-year-old daughter. He could give orders to all of Chicago. He could make anyone do anything, but he couldn't give his child the one thing she needed most in this world. That night, after Zoe fell asleep, Elijah sat alone in the pitch-dark living room. He didn't turn on a light. He didn't pour a drink. He only sat there. On the table in front of him was the drawing with 3 stick figures, the woman in the purple dress and red shoes standing beside his daughter, holding his daughter's hand, a smile drawn in the clumsy curved line of a child who couldn't even write her own name yet. And in the darkness of a mansion worth millions of dollars, Elijah began to think of something insane. Elijah had been sitting in his office for 2 hours since Zoe fell asleep. This room was the one place in the mansion he forbade his daughter to enter. And there was a reason. The left desk drawer held a loaded Beretta. The right drawer held 3 burner phones he replaced every week. On the wall behind him was a map of Chicago pinned full of colored tacks, red marking territory, blue for allies, black for enemies, and yellow for places that needed to be cleaned up. The Mafia world seeped into every brick of this house, even into the bedroom of a 3-year-old lying 2 doors away. He stared at the drawing of 3 stick figures he'd carried up from the living room and set beside the gun. The woman in the purple dress and red shoes, the mother his daughter dreamed of. He didn't have a woman in his life. Ever since Vanessa disappeared, he didn't look at anyone, didn't touch anyone, didn't let anyone close enough to learn there was a child inside this mansion, because anyone who got close to Elijah Ashford became a target, and he'd learned that lesson through his own wife. But Zoe needed a mother. Not forever. Just for the birthday party. Just long enough that she wouldn't be the only child in the room, with no one holding her hand except her father. And then, he remembered the bakery. Last month, Brennan had bought a test birthday cake for Zoe from a small shop in Pilsen, nearly 40 minutes' drive from the mansion. It was an underworld habit. Brennan ran a thorough background check on the owner before buying anything for the boss's daughter. The report was on the tablet Brennan had shown him 2 weeks earlier, and Elijah still remembered every line. Phoebe Lawson, 27, white, light brown hair, born and raised in Pilsen. Her father died when she was 15, a workplace accident at a steel plant on the south side of Chicago. Her mother was Ruth Lawson, 56, currently being treated for stage 3 cancer at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Phoebe dropped out in her 3rd year of an early childhood education program to take care of her mother and keep the family bakery afloat. Lawson's bakery had existed for 2 generations, but revenue had fallen sharply over the past year. Medical debt piled up. No criminal record, no history, no ties to any organization. Completely clean. Just a young woman slowly dying from trying to keep her mother alive. But what stayed in his mind wasn't the report. It was the moment he brought Zoe into the shop that day to choose a cake design. Zoe was tasting a bite of cake with strawberry frosting when a streak of cream splattered onto the owner's dress. Elijah had been ready to apologize and pay for it, but the light brown-haired girl knelt down to Zoe's level, smiled with her eyes and not only her mouth, and said, "It's okay, sweetheart. Strawberry cream is the prettiest color. Now my dress is a princess dress too." Zoe had laughed. Really laughed. the kind of laugh Elijah rarely heard from his daughter. And that girl looked at Zoe with a kind of expression he couldn't describe. Something soft and natural, as if kneeling to talk to a child covered in frosting was the most ordinary thing in the world. Elijah remembered standing there watching the two of them for a few seconds, and in those few seconds, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. He knew this idea was insane. He knew it was wrong by every moral measure. But Elijah Ashford didn't live by morality. He lived by decisions. And he'd decided. 10 o'clock at night. Brennan. His voice came through the internal intercom. Bring the car around. We're going to Pilsen. Brennan didn't ask why. He never did. 20 minutes later, the black SUV parked in front of Lawson's Bakery. Pilsen at night was quiet. Streetlights weak and yellow. A few bars in the distance still leaking music, but the bakery was still lit. Through the glass door, Elijah saw the young woman wiping down tables. Light brown hair tied back in a ponytail, a white apron dusted with flour, a slim frame, shoulders slightly hunched from exhaustion. She wiped the tables with slow, mechanical motions, the way someone does after a 16-hour shift, when all they want is to go home but they're not done yet. Brennan stood guard by the SUV, arms crossed, face blank. Elijah stepped to the bakery door and knocked. The woman looked up, looked outside, saw the man in the black suit and the SUV behind him. She pointed at the sign that said closed and turned back to her tables. Elijah knocked again, harder. Please, 5 minutes. Phoebe froze, staring at him through the glass, staring at the black vehicle, staring at the big man standing watch outside. Every survival instinct in her body told her not to open the door. But there was something in the eyes of the man in front of her, something that didn't match the frightening exterior. She unlocked the door. We're closed. If you want to order a cake, come back tomorrow morning. I'm not here for cake. Elijah stepped inside, standing in the middle of the shop, among old wooden tables and a glass display case of pastries. At nearly 6'3", he looked like a giant who'd wandered into a dollhouse. He told her about Zoe, about the drawing with 2 stick figures, about the red-rimmed eyes in the corner of a preschool classroom, about a birthday wish he couldn't fulfill. Phoebe listened, a cleaning cloth still in her hand, her back against the register counter. Her face shifted from wary to confused, from confused to compassion. And then Elijah said it plainly. I need you to pretend to be my wife for 2 weeks, 3 days before the birthday party, the day of the party, and 10 days after, so she won't be shocked when you suddenly leave. He set an envelope on the counter. This is enough to cover your mother's hospital bills for the next 6 months. Phoebe's face drained of color. She took a step back until her spine hit the pastry shelf behind her. You know about my mother. Not a question. A statement. You've been watching me. I'm careful. I don't put my daughter in the hands of a stranger without knowing who she is. Phoebe looked at the envelope, then at him. Who are you? Elijah paused for a beat. Then he said, in a flat voice, as if he were announcing the weather, I'm a dangerous man. You're smart enough to look at the car out there, look at the man standing guard, and understand I'm not a normal businessman. But I'm not dangerous to you, if you agree. Phoebe looked at the envelope again. Then she looked at the man standing in front of her, the faint scar on his jaw, the gray eyes cold but bloodshot with lack of sleep, and she understood she was standing in front of a deal with the devil. The bakery door closed behind Elijah, the little wind chime above it jingling and then falling silent. Phoebe stood still with her back against the wooden door, her knees threatening to give out. The envelope lay on the register counter, thick, heavy, stark white against smudges of flour and old coffee stains. She stared at it the way you stare at a bomb with a ticking clock. Outside, the engine of the black SUV faded and disappeared into the Chicago night. She stayed where she was, still gripping the cleaning cloth, her fingers squeezing until they went pale. Then her phone vibrated. The screen showed the number for Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the number she knew more intimately than her own. She answered, and the woman's voice on the other end was cool and professionally detached, the kind of voice that had delivered bad news so many times it no longer flinched. Miss Lawson, I'm calling to remind you that the hospital balance and your mother Ruth Lawson's chemotherapy costs are past due. If payment isn't received by tomorrow, we'll be forced to discontinue her treatment plan per policy. Discontinue her treatment plan. The words rang in Phoebe's head like a hammer sealing a coffin lid. Discontinue meant stopping chemo. Stopping chemo meant the cancer cells would spread without restraint. And with her mother's stage 3 diagnosis, it meant death. Not death years from now, but death in a few months, maybe a few weeks. I understand. I'll handle it. She ended the call and set the phone down on the counter beside the envelope. The two objects lay side by side, a phone carrying a sentence and an envelope, holding life-saving money, like two hands pressed to her shoulders, one dragging her toward the abyss, the other offering a way out she knew wasn't free. Phoebe lifted her eyes to the photograph on the bakery wall. An old picture, the edges yellowed with age, showing Ruth when she was young, light brown hair just like Phoebe's now, smiling brightly beside the pastry case on the bakery's opening day. She looked healthy, overflowing with life, a spotless white apron, a tray of fresh-baked cookies in her hands. Next to her stood Mr. Lawson, Phoebe's father, broad-shouldered, flour on his hands, smiling with his whole face. He died when Phoebe was 15, an accident at the steel plant, and from that day on, Ruth carried the bakery alone, raised her daughter alone, paid every bill alone, stood at the counter until midnight, kneaded dough until dawn so there would be bread on the shelves in the morning. Phoebe grew up in the smell of melting butter and the sound of her mother singing softly in the kitchen at 4 o'clock in the morning. She loved children. She wanted to be a preschool teacher. She made it to her 3rd year in an early childhood education program, until Ruth collapsed on the bakery kitchen floor one July afternoon. Cancer. Stage 2. Then quickly climbing to stage 3, Phoebe left school immediately, without hesitation and without regret, because the bakery needed someone to keep it running, and her mother needed someone to care for her. The dream of teaching stayed behind in the dorm desk drawer, along with the child psychology books she never got to finish. Now Lawson's was barely surviving. On the best days, she sold a handful of loaves and a few cookies. Debt stacked on debt. Rent 2 months overdue. Her mother's medical bills were a number Phoebe didn't even dare add up, because she was terrified of seeing the total, and the envelope on the counter held enough to erase all of it. 6 months of hospital bills. 6 months of her mother staying alive, being treated, being allowed to fight. The price was 2 weeks pretending to be the wife of a man she knew was dangerous. Phoebe picked up the envelope and weighed it in her hand, heavy, not only because of the cash inside, but because of the decision it demanded. She thought about the man's eyes as he spoke about his daughter. Those steel gray eyes that had trembled when he mentioned the drawing with 2 stick figures. He said, "I'm a dangerous man," in the same calm tone someone might use to say they were left-handed. No hiding, no pretty lies, no justification. And somehow, that ruthless honesty made Phoebe believe him about one thing at least. He was desperate for his child. Choosing between 2 bad things. Phoebe spoke aloud into the empty shop, her voice echoing off the old walls. "And I'm choosing to save my mother." She grabbed her phone and called Aunt Janet. "Auntie, I need you to watch the bakery for 2 weeks. I have to go handle something." Aunt Janet asked what it was. Phoebe said she was helping a family with childcare. Not entirely a lie. The next morning, Phoebe stood at the iron gate of the Lincoln Park mansion with a small suitcase and a heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. A security camera turned toward her, its lens cold like an eye measuring her worth. The gate opened, she stepped through, and a second layer of security met her in the entry hall. A guard checked her identification, then led her inside. The mansion was just as cold in daylight as it was at night. Natural light poured through massive windows, but it couldn't warm the air. No family photographs, no children's art on the walls, no animal-shaped magnets on the refrigerator. Phoebe thought of her own bakery, where her childhood scribbles still clung to the fridge, where pictures of her parents covered the walls, where the scent of butter lived in every brick. Then she looked around this $1,000,000 house and understood why a child growing up here could feel so alone. Elijah was waiting in the living room, black suit, tie loosened, a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him. He handed Phoebe a stack of papers, the fake script. They met 6 months ago, dated in secret, married privately because Elijah valued privacy. Phoebe skimmed it and nodded. Then Brennan walked in and placed another document in front of her, a non-disclosure agreement. Brennan's voice was flat, without emotion. "You're not allowed to disclose any information about the Ashford family, the residence, habits, schedule, or anything you see or hear while you're here. Violations will have consequences." Consequences. The word hung in the air, requiring no explanation to be understood. Phoebe took the pen, but before she signed, She looked straight into Elijah's eyes. I'm not afraid of paperwork. I've signed loan documents, signed surgical consent forms for my mother, signed enough things ordinary people never want to sign. What I'm afraid of isn't on paper. Elijah's brow tightened. What are you afraid of? I'm afraid of hurting a child. I studied early childhood education for 3 years before I left. I know what abandonment trauma is. I know how deeply a 3-year-old who's already lost her mother will be wounded if another woman shows up and then disappears again. She signed the non-disclosure agreement, set the pen down, and asked the question Elijah didn't want to hear. When the 2 weeks are over, what do you tell her? That another mother left too? Elijah's face went pale, his jaw clenched, the tendons in his neck standing out, but not from anger. From the fact that the bakery girl had asked the exact question he'd refused to think about for the past 2 days. He, a man who had a plan for everything, a man who ran an underworld empire with cold calculation down to the smallest detail, had no answer for this. Elijah still hadn't answered Phoebe's question when the sound of the preschool shuttle arrived outside the gate. He stood up, tugged his suit jacket straight, and his face transformed in an instant, from a man cornered by a bakery girl's question into a father preparing to greet his child. Phoebe watched that shift and understood Elijah had spent his whole life in masks, and the one he wore for Zoe was the only mask he put on with love instead of calculation. The front door opened. The nanny led Zoe into the entry hall. The little girl wore a pink dress, her hair tied into 2 uneven braids, a princess backpack on her shoulders. Zoe took 3 steps and then stopped short. Her big brown eyes caught sight of Phoebe standing in the living room, and everything in that 3-year-old's body froze. No smile, no greeting, no question. Zoe backed up 2 steps and hid behind her father's leg, her tiny hands gripping the fabric of Elijah's trouser leg, her face only half peeking out, her eyes studying Phoebe with a look no child that age should ever have. Measuring, guarded, evaluating. Those were the eyes of a child who had been left once and taught herself never to trust adults again. Elijah knelt down and spoke gently. Zoe, this is Phoebe. Daddy told you about her, remember? She's going to be here with us for a while. Zoe didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed locked on Phoebe, sweeping from head to toe, as if she were calculating how long this woman would last before she vanished. Then she opened her mouth, and the first thing she said wasn't hello, and it wasn't a question. It was a verdict. You're going to leave too. Phoebe's heart tightened. She had prepared for many things: shyness, tears, avoidance. She had not prepared for the cold resignation in the voice of a child not yet 4. There was no anger in that sentence, no sadness, only a truth Zoe had learned from experience. Adults come and go, and hoping they will stay only makes it hurt more. Phoebe lowered herself slowly to her knees, bringing her eyes level with Zoe's. She didn't rush. She didn't push. She didn't paste on an overly bright smile. She only knelt there and opened the paper box she had brought from the bakery that morning. Inside were heart-shaped cookies, iced in pale pink, dusted with powdered sugar, the soft scent of vanilla butter rising gently. She'd been up since 4 o'clock to make them, kneading the dough by hand, cutting each one with the heart-shaped cutter her mother had used since Phoebe was a little girl. I brought you something. Do you want to try it? Zoe looked at the box, then at Phoebe, then at the box again. She didn't reach for it right away. It took nearly half a minute before Zoe timidly extended her hand, picked one up, smelled it first, and then took a bite. She chewed slowly, swallowed. Good. 1 word. No smile. But she didn't walk away. Zoe took a second cookie, bit into it, and looked at Phoebe with those big brown eyes still cautious, but a little less cold by a few degrees. You make cookies? Yeah. I have a bakery. Do you have a mom? The question came out suddenly, as casually as asking whether Phoebe had a cat. Phoebe swallowed. I do. But my mom is very sick. She has to stay in the hospital. Zoe stopped chewing. She looked at Phoebe with a gaze only people who have lost something can share, a kind of empathy far beyond her age. I don't have a mom either. She said it softly, her voice flat, as if it were an obvious fact she had accepted a long time ago. Then she bent down and took another cookie, took a big bite, and for the first time since they met, Zoe didn't look at Phoebe with the eyes of someone defending herself. She looked at Phoebe with the eyes of a child eating something delicious. Elijah stood behind them, watching, his jaw clenched, his eyes red. He turned his head away before anyone could see. That evening, Phoebe lay in the guest room Elijah had arranged for her. A room as large as the entire Lawson's bakery, with a king-size bed, velvet curtains, oak furniture, everything expensive, and everything unfamiliar. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the mansion breathe in the night. The house was too big, too quiet. A quiet that wasn't peaceful but hollow. The kind of quiet in places with too many rooms and too few people, too many objects and too few memories. She thought of the small bakery in Pilsen, where the refrigerator hummed all night, where flour dust clung to her pillow, where she could hear her mother coughing in the next room and know her mother was still alive, still fighting. Here she heard only silence, and that silence felt heavier than any noise. Phoebe was drifting into a shallow sleep when she heard a knock. Light, hesitant, the kind of knock made by someone afraid of being turned away. She opened the door and found Zoe standing there, tiny in bunny pajamas, clutching a worn stuffed bear, eyes red-rimmed, cheeks wet. "I dreamed about a different mom." Zoe's voice trembled. The different mom came back. She hugged me, and then she left again. I called her, but she didn't turn around. Then bad people came. A lot of people. They came to our house. Daddy fought them. Daddy was bleeding. I was scared. Phoebe didn't know whether the different mom was Vanessa or whether it was her, and that uncertainty hurt more than anything else. But what made her shiver was the second part. The bad people, the violence, Daddy fighting and bleeding. This 3-year-old was dreaming of violence she had never witnessed. She was sensing it, through late-night phone calls where Daddy's voice turned cold, through strange guards standing watch all over the house, through the office door that was always locked, through the tension. Adults tried to hide, but children always smell. Phoebe didn't speak. She only sat down on the floor, opened her arms wide, and waited. Zoe stood there for a moment, staring at her with wet eyes, then stepped forward and curled into Phoebe's lap, as if it were the only safe place left in the world. She was tiny, weightless, warm, smelling of strawberry shampoo and tears. Phoebe held her, stroked her hair, said nothing, only held her, and Zoe whispered into Phoebe's chest, her voice less shaky now. "You smell like cookies." "I like that smell." Phoebe bit her lip. Tears fell, but she didn't let Zoe see. She held the little girl tighter, hummed the lullaby Ruth used to sing to her when she was small, and Zoe slowly loosened, her breathing evening out, her hand still gripping Phoebe's shirt even after she fell asleep. Out in the hallway, Elijah stood watching through a crack in the half-open door. He saw his daughter curled in the arms of a stranger, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, without needing Daddy to carry her into his room at midnight, without jerking awake, without screaming, only sleeping, calm, her hand holding the fabric of the woman holding her, and he felt something shift inside his chest, in the place he thought had frozen solid the day Vanessa left, something warm and soft, and more dangerous than any enemy he had ever faced, because he didn't know how to fight it, and he didn't want to. Morning light slipped through the velvet curtains when Phoebe opened her eyes. Zoe was still curled against her, one small hand gripping the edge of Phoebe's shirt, her breathing steady and soft. Phoebe didn't dare move, afraid she'd wake her, so she lay still and studied the sleeping face of a 3-year-old. The lightly curled brown strands stuck to her forehead, long lashes casting shadows over round cheeks, lips parted, a stuffed bear tucked under her chin. In sleep, Zoe looked exactly her age. No searching stare, no cold resignation, only a small child sleeping well. Then, Zoe stirred, her eyes cracked open, her chocolate-colored gaze, foggy with drowsiness as she looked up. She saw Phoebe, and her first reaction wasn't a yawn or a sleepy rub. It was a flinch, as if she couldn't believe the person she'd held all night was still here. Then she blinked a few times, stared more carefully, and her face lit up in the way only children can light up. A raw brightness life hasn't dulled yet. "You didn't leave." Zoe said it loudly, her voice filling the wide room, not a question but a confirmation. Astonishment. A tiny joy so sharp it almost hurt. The joy of a child used to waking up alone who woke up with someone beside her. Phoebe smiled, and the smile hurt more than she expected. "I didn't leave." Zoe sat up, hair a wild mess, looking at Phoebe with eyes that still held a trace of doubt, but had begun to want to believe. "Are you hungry?" "I'm hungry." And the two of them went down to the kitchen. The mansion kitchen was the size of half of Lawson's bakery, packed with expensive appliances. Phoebe was sure no one had used even halfway. She opened the refrigerator and found eggs, milk, flour, butter. Want to make pancakes? Zoe nodded and climbed onto the tall chair beside the island, feet swinging. Phoebe mixed the flour, poured in milk, whisked until smooth, then turned to Zoe. Do you want to crack the eggs? Zoe's eyes brightened. She held an egg in both hands, careful as if it were a treasure. Phoebe showed her how. Tap it gently on the rim of the bowl, then pull it apart. Zoe tapped. Too hard. The egg shattered in her hands, yolk and white splashing across the island, dripping onto the cold marble floor, smearing onto the sleeve of her bunny pajamas. Zoe froze. Her little hands, slick with egg, began to tremble. Her eyes went wide, her whole body tightening as if she were waiting for something terrible. She didn't cry. Worse than crying. She was scared. I ruined it. Zoe's voice was so small, Phoebe almost couldn't hear it. I'm sorry. I'll clean it. I'll clean it right now. Zoe reached for a towel, tiny fingers shaking hard, still sticky with egg. And Phoebe understood this wasn't about a broken egg. This was the response of a child used to being judged, used to needing to be perfect, used to believing any mistake could make someone leave. Phoebe gently took the towel from Zoe's hand and set it down, then knelt until she was eye level with her. Zoe, look at me. Zoe lifted her face, eyes already red. You didn't ruin anything. You're learning. The first time anyone cracks an egg, it goes everywhere. When I was little, I dropped a whole dozen eggs on the kitchen floor, and my mom had to clean for an hour before it was all gone. Zoe blinked. Really? Really? My mom said broken eggs are okay, as long as next time we tap a little softer. Zoe looked at Phoebe with an expression Phoebe could read, even if a 3-year-old didn't have the words for it yet. A mix of surprise and something deeper, something Phoebe recognized instantly. The feeling of being accepted even when you mess up, something Zoe had never received from a woman. Phoebe handed Zoe a second egg. This time, just tap gently, okay? Zoe took the egg, drew in a deep breath, and tapped softly against the rim of the bowl. The shell cracked cleanly. She pulled it apart, and the yolk slid neatly into the bowl without a single drop spilling. I did it, Zoe shouted, eyes huge, looking down at the bowl and then up at Phoebe, smiling with her whole face. Phoebe clapped. Perfect. A professional chef. Always. And that smile, that bright smile that held nothing back, the smile of a child who had done something and been praised for it, stayed in Phoebe's chest all day long, and for many days after. They poured batter into the pan, flipped pancakes, Zoe standing on the chair with the solemn expression of someone carrying out the most important mission of her life. Then, while they ate pancakes drizzled with honey, Zoe suddenly asked, Will you teach me how to make those sweet little hearts like yesterday? Phoebe nodded. Of course, we'll make them this afternoon. And that afternoon, the two of them stood in the kitchen, Phoebe kneading dough, Zoe using the cutter to make misshapen heart shapes. She laughed when the cookies came out of the oven, laughed when they spread icing, laughed when icing smeared all over her nose. But in the middle of piping the frosting, Zoe went quiet, set the frosting bag down, and looked at Phoebe with eyes far older than her years. Miss Phoebe, I don't have any memories with my mom. Phoebe's hands stilled. I was too little when she left. I don't remember her face. I don't remember how she hugged me. I don't remember what she smelled like. Zoe's voice stayed even. No crying, no blame, only telling it, with the frightening calm of a child who had absorbed pain as part of life. Phoebe knelt down, her flour-dusted hands closing around Zoe's tiny flour-dusted hands. Listen to me. Her leaving wasn't your fault. It was never your fault. Zoe watched her, head tilted slightly. Daddy says that too, but if it's not my fault, whose fault is it? Phoebe couldn't answer, because she knew where the answer lived, behind the locked office door upstairs, inside the world of guns and blood and territory maps, inside the very man Elijah Ashford was. But she couldn't say that to a 3-year-old who was looking at her with trust for the first time. On the morning of the third day, Phoebe stood in the upstairs hallway and watched Elijah get ready to leave. He knelt in front of Zoe in the entry hall, both hands resting on her shoulders, and kissed her forehead. Daddy's going to work. Daddy will be home this afternoon. You stay here with Phoebe, okay? Zoe nodded, a stuffed bear in her arms, watching him with the familiar expression of a child who had seen too many adults walk out the door. Elijah stood, tugged his black suit jacket straight, fastened his cufflinks, and in that moment Phoebe saw the switch flip as clearly as a light turning on. The soft face of the father vanished. In its place came a clenched jaw, a stormy, calculating expression, heavy steps that moved with purpose. He walked out. Brennan was already waiting by the black SUV. The door closed, and they disappeared behind the iron gate. Phoebe didn't ask where he was going. She didn't have the right to ask, and honestly, she didn't want to know the answer. But this mansion wouldn't let her pretend anything was normal. After Elijah left, Phoebe took Zoe up to the playroom, and on the way she began to notice what she'd been too overwhelmed to see on the first day. Security cameras at every corner of the hallway, small, discreet, but everywhere, in the ceiling, at the baseboards, near the windows. She counted 7 of them just from the living room to Zoe's playroom. 2 guards rotated shifts at the gate. Another patrolled the house. All of them wore black suits, earpieces, and spoke into their radios in a steady stream of numbers Phoebe didn't understand. The door to Elijah's office at the far end of the second-floor hallway was always shut, an electronic lock, a red light blinking. Sometimes, when Phoebe passed it, she heard a phone ringing inside, even though no one was home. Zoe was drawing in the playroom when she looked up and said, in the same casual tone a child might use to talk about the weather, "The machine in Daddy's room keeps making noise. All day and all night. Daddy says I can never go in that room. Even if the door is open, I'm not allowed to step inside." Phoebe looked at her and realized Zoe had grown up in this house, surrounded by cameras and guards and locked doors, and she thought it was normal. That was the most frightening thing of all. Elijah came home at 9 o'clock that night, later than he said he would. Phoebe had fed Zoe, bathed her, read her a story, and rocked her to sleep. She went down to the kitchen for water and stopped in the doorway. Elijah stood at the sink with his back to her, his hands under running water. He hadn't changed. He was still in a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and the faucet streamed over both hands. The water ran into the basin, and Phoebe saw it had color. She took one more step, and he heard her. Elijah turned his head. They looked at each other across the wide kitchen, and Phoebe saw it clearly. On the cuff of his shirt, at the part he hadn't rolled up yet, there was a dark red smear. Blood. Not a lot, but enough to stand out on white fabric. Enough that no one could pretend it was ketchup or red wine. The kitchen went silent. The running faucet was the only sound between them. Elijah looked at Phoebe. Phoebe looked at the blood, then up at his eyes. "It's not my blood." Elijah's voice was even. No excuses, no panic, just the truth, delivered as calmly as a forecast. "I didn't ask." Phoebe answered, her voice even too, though she knew he could hear the tremor underneath it. "But you're thinking." "I'm thinking your daughter is sleeping 10 steps away, and you come home with blood on your sleeve." Elijah turned off the faucet. The kitchen became so quiet it felt hard to breathe. He looked at Phoebe, then down at his sleeve, then quietly pulled off the shirt, rolled it up, and tossed it into the trash under the sink. Underneath, he wore a fitted black t-shirt, and for the first time, Phoebe saw the scars on his arms, old and new, long and short, a map of violence written into skin. "I protect my family." His voice dropped, low and heavy. "Everything I do is so Zoe stays safe. You may not agree with how I do it, but don't doubt why." Phoebe held his gaze. She didn't step back. She'd stepped back enough already. Back from the envelope of money. Back from the non-disclosure agreement. Back from the mansion and the guards and the cameras. But the blood on his sleeve was a line she couldn't retreat from. "What family? This house is cold as a grave. There are 7 cameras from the living room to her room. Your daughter dreams about you fighting bad people. She's 3, and she already knows which rooms she's not allowed to step into. You call that protecting your family?" His jaw tightened. The tendons in his neck rose. His gray eyes darkened. In that moment, Phoebe saw the Mafia boss Chicago feared, not the father who knelt to kiss a forehead. But he didn't argue. He only stood there, gripping the edge of the sink, silent, because he knew she was right, and being right hurt more than any wound he carried. Phoebe turned away, went up the stairs, went into her room, and closed the door. Their first conflict, rough, blunt, with no romance in it at all. Only the truth, laid bare between 2 people standing in a kitchen that still seemed to smell like blood. But at 2 a.m, Phoebe couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, thinking about that dark red smear, about the scars, about Elijah's eyes when she confronted him. She went down to the kitchen for water, and as she passed the living room, she stopped. A soft yellow nightlight glowed from the corner. Elijah was sitting on the cold marble floor, his back against the sofa leg, his legs stretched out. Across his lap, Zoe lay curled up, her head resting on his thigh, eyes closed, lips parted. He was reading to her in a small, warm voice. Phoebe had never heard him use. Gentle, slow, patient, each word spoken as if it were a gift he was giving his daughter. The book was a princess story, the cover worn from being read so often. He finished a page, looked down at Zoe, brushed her hair lightly with one finger, and kissed her forehead. Then he whispered, his voice rough, as if he were speaking more to himself than to the sleeping child. "I'm sorry for the world I built, my girl. I'm sorry you have to grow up in this house with locked doors and strangers standing guard. I wanted to give you a better world. But I only know how to live in this one." He didn't know Phoebe was standing behind the wall, one hand gripping the corner, tears sliding down her cheeks, and her heart beat differently. Not love, not yet, but for the first time, she saw the real person behind the Mafia boss, behind the blood on his sleeve and the scars on his arms, behind the cold gray eyes and the clenched jaw. That person was a father breaking apart, sitting on a cold floor at 2 a.m. reading princess stories so his daughter could sleep, apologizing to a child for sins the child never should have to know. On the 4th day, Elijah told Phoebe to take Zoe out to buy decorations for the birthday party. He handed her an unlimited credit card and said, flat and brief, buy whatever she wants. Then he turned into his office. The door closing, the red light of the electronic lock blinking. Brennan drove the black SUV, and a silver sedan followed behind with 2 guards Phoebe had never seen before. There was a tail everywhere they went. She sat in the back seat with Zoe and watched through the window as the sedan held close at about 3 car lengths, and she wondered if she'd ever get used to a life where even buying balloons for a child's birthday party required an escort. They stopped at a large party supply store on Michigan Avenue. Brennan stood watch outside the SUV. The 2 guards from the silver sedan spread out to either end of the block. Phoebe took Zoe inside, and the little girl was instantly swept into a world of balloons, tinsel, paper hats, and glittering banners. Zoe ran from aisle to aisle, eyes shining, pointing at everything. Pink castle-shaped balloons, silver star garlands, princess tablecloths, paper plates with gold crowns. And as she ran, Zoe's hand reached for Phoebe's without thinking. A tiny hand slid into a larger one, as natural as breathing, as if it were the reflex of a child used to holding her mother's hand in a grocery store. Then Zoe startled, realizing what she was doing, and let go immediately, cheeks flushing red, eyes dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry. I didn't know if I'm allowed to hold your hand." That sentence hurt more than a slap. A 3-year-old who had to ask permission to hold an adult's hand, who had to weigh whether the most instinctive act of affection was even allowed. Phoebe knelt in the aisle filled with balloons, took that small hand, and said gently, "Of course you are. If you want to hold my hand, then hold it." Zoe looked at Phoebe's hand holding hers, then up at Phoebe's face, and held on again, this time tighter. And she didn't let go for the rest of the shopping trip. They were choosing birthday candles when an elderly woman with silver hair walked past, looked at them, and smiled. "Such a sweet family. Your daughter looks just like you." Phoebe went still. Zoe lifted her face to Phoebe, those wide, innocent pools waiting, searching, as if this were a test she already knew the answer to. She was waiting for Phoebe to say, "Oh no, I'm not her mother," waiting for the truth, waiting to be pushed away again. Phoebe smiled at the woman. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." The woman walked on, and Zoe kept staring at Phoebe, her grip tightening. It wasn't until they got back to the car that she asked, her voice small, careful, as if she feared the answer. "Why didn't you say you're not my mom?" Phoebe looked at Zoe in the rearview mirror. "Because you were holding my hand, and it felt like the truest thing I could say." Zoe didn't say anything else, but she turned to look out the window, and in the faint reflection on the glass, Phoebe saw something that looked like a smile, tiny and fleeting, but there. That afternoon, Brennan called Phoebe into the hallway while Zoe watched cartoons. Northwestern called. Someone sent fresh flowers to Ruth Lawson's room. White roses and yellow daisies. No sender name. I checked the hospital cameras. The delivery person came from a flower shop on Oak Street. The order was paid in cash. Brennan's voice stayed level and emotionless, but they both knew there was only one man in that house who paid for everything in cash and never left his name. Phoebe didn't say anything, but that evening, when Elijah came home, she looked at him longer than usual. He frowned. What? Nothing. She turned away, but he had seen something in her eyes he wasn't used to seeing from anyone. Not fear, not admiration, something close to gratitude, but warmer than that, and Elijah didn't know what to do with it, so he only nodded and walked into his office. On the 5th night, Phoebe was sitting in the living room reading when she heard small footsteps on the stairs. Zoe appeared holding a pink plastic comb, looking at Phoebe with an expression that was half wanting to ask and half afraid of being refused. "Miss Phoebe, do you know how to braid hair?" "I do. Come here." Zoe sat on the floor in front of Phoebe and turned her back, her small shoulders stiff. Phoebe began to brush her hair gently, working through each knot without yanking, and she felt Zoe slowly relax under her hands, the little shoulders lowering, her breathing slowing. Phoebe divided the hair into 3 sections and started to braid, strand by strand, steady and soft. Zoe closed her eyes. "It feels like what I imagine having a mom feels like." Phoebe didn't stop her hands, because she didn't want Zoe to see her eyes were wet. When she finished, she tied it off with a pink elastic and led Zoe to the mirror. Zoe looked at herself, 2 neat braids, and she smiled. A real smile, not the polite smile when someone says, "Smile for the picture," not the forced smile when Daddy buys a new toy. A bright smile from the inside, a smile that filled her small face completely. So radiant the cold room seemed to light up. "I look like a princess." Zoe turned and wrapped her arms around Phoebe's leg, pressing her face into Phoebe's knee, giggling. Phoebe rested her hand on Zoe's head, smoothing her hair, and laughed too, even as tears threatened to spill. Before bed, Phoebe tucked Zoe in, finished a fairy tale, and was about to stand when Zoe grabbed her hand. Zoe pulled a small plastic key from beneath the pillow, yellow, no bigger than a finger, the kind of key that comes with a dollhouse playset. "Miss Phoebe, this is the key to my room." Phoebe held the plastic key. "You don't have to knock. You can come in. Anytime I have a nightmare, or anytime you want, you can come in." Phoebe closed her fingers around the little plastic key, and she understood this 3-year-old had just handed her the most precious thing an abandoned child could hand anyone: permission to step into her private world, where she slept, where she cried, where she dreamed nightmares about a mother leaving and a father fighting bad men. "Thank you. I'll keep it safe." Zoe smiled, and then the smile faded. She looked at Phoebe and asked in the voice Phoebe had heard too many times in the past few days, that calm, resigned voice. "Miss Phoebe, will you still be here after my birthday?" Phoebe opened her mouth, and no words came out. Not because she didn't want to speak, but because any answer she gave would be either a lie or a blade. The silence stretched. Zoe looked at her, waiting, then nodded faintly, as if the silence itself was the answer she had already known. "It's okay. I know." She turned her back, pulled the blanket up to her chin, hugged her stuffed bear, and closed her eyes. No crying, no more questions, only acceptance, with a quiet cruelty no child that age should ever learn. Phoebe stood outside Zoe's door, the small yellow prize in her palm, and she understood a 3-year-old had just handed her an entire heart, and in a few days, she was going to break it. On the morning of the 6th day, Phoebe decided to take Zoe to the park. The little girl had been in the mansion for nearly a week, and even though the house was enormous, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to breathe, air that didn't carry the expensive scent of room fragrance, and the constant tension that never quite left. Brennan drove the familiar black SUV, and Phoebe noticed that this time there was no silver sedan following them the way there had been on the party shopping trip. She asked Brennan about it. He only said, curt and final, "Today, I'm enough." Phoebe didn't understand what enough meant in the language of people who lived by guns, but she didn't ask again. Oz Park was 10 minutes from the mansion, shaded by green trees, a few families walking dogs, children running across the grass. Normal. Safe. At least it looked that way. Brennan parked near the entrance and told Phoebe, "I'm staying here. Take her in. Don't go past the swings." Phoebe led Zoe into the park, and the little girl looked like she'd been released into paradise. Zoe ran to the swings, climbed on, her small legs pumping through the air, and for the first time Phoebe heard her laugh out loud. Not the small kitchen giggle or the quiet smile in the mirror, but the full, ringing laughter of a 4-year-old swinging under the sun. Push me higher, Miss Phoebe. I want to fly. Phoebe pushed the swing. Zoe threw her head back, hair flying, eyes shut, laughing. And in that moment, there was no mansion, no cameras, no locked doors, no guards. There was only a child and a woman in a Chicago park on a spring morning, ordinary enough to hurt, because they both knew it wasn't real. Then everything changed in 3 seconds. Phoebe was pushing the swing when a large hand clamped onto her shoulder from behind, firm and decisive, and Brennan's voice hit her ear, low and tight like a string about to snap. Get in the car, right now. Deefa didn't even have time to react. Brennan stepped forward and lifted Zoe off the swing with one hand. His other hand pressed to Phoebe's back, steering her toward the parking lot. Not running. Fast, but not running. The kind of movement trained for urgency without drawing attention. Zoe panicked, eyes wide, arms locked around Brennan's neck. Uncle Brennan, what's wrong? Brennan didn't answer. He opened the car, put Zoe in the back seat. Phoebe climbed in beside her. The door slammed. The central locks clicked into place. Brennan took the driver's seat, started the engine, but didn't pull out right away. He checked the rearview mirror, then the right mirror, and Phoebe followed his gaze outside. At the end of the path, about 50 meters from where they were parked, a black sedan sat tight to the curb, 2 silhouettes inside. They didn't get out. They didn't shut the engine off. The windows were tinted, but Phoebe could still make out the driver's shape turn toward them. Who is that? Phoebe asked, her voice calmer than she expected. Brennan didn't answer. His left hand stayed on the wheel. His right hand lifted the phone and called Elijah. We've got a tail at Oz Park. Black sedan, no front plate, 2 men. I'm bringing them back. He hung up, eased out of the lot, turned left, and Phoebe saw the black sedan slowly peel away from the curb and follow. Brennan drove with steady control. No sudden acceleration. Turned onto one street, then right, then left, looping around 3 blocks before returning to the main road. The sedan disappeared after the second turn, but Brennan looped once more before heading back toward the mansion. In the back seat, Zoe clung to Phoebe, face pressed into her chest, her whole body shaking. Bad people, Miss Phoebe. Like in my dream? Phoebe held her, stroked her hair, and said words of comfort she didn't fully believe herself. It's okay. Uncle Brennan is just being careful. But Phoebe's heart was pounding hard enough to crack her ribs, and the hand stroking Zoe's hair trembled almost as much as the little girl did. Elijah came home at 7 o'clock that evening, earlier than usual, and the face he wore as he stepped through the door wasn't a father's face. It was the face of a boss in fight mode, jaw set, gray eyes storm dark, footsteps heavy. He spoke with Brennan in the entry hall in a low voice Phoebe couldn't make out. Brennan nodded and disappeared outside, probably to tighten security. Elijah went upstairs to Zoe's room, kissed her forehead while she slept, then found Phoebe in the living room. He closed the door, and for the first time since she arrived, he spoke to her with real gravity. Not the voice of a man playing husband, but the voice of a mafia boss facing a threat. Marco Salerno's men. They're watching this house. Phoebe swallowed. Since when? Brennan noticed it 2 days ago but couldn't confirm. Today confirmed. They know there's someone new here. Are they watching me? Or watching you? Both. Elijah looked straight into Phoebe's eyes, and she saw it in his sharp, metallic gaze. Not only anger, but fear. He was afraid. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago was afraid. Not for himself, but for the child asleep upstairs, and for the bakery girl sitting in front of him. This is Marco's play. He looks for weak points. He did it to Vanessa. Surveillance, photos, threatening letters, until she couldn't take it and she left. Now he sees a new woman in my house, and he's testing who you are, how much you matter, and whether you can be used as leverage. Phoebe sat still. She heard every word, and every word felt like another brick in a wall closing around her, higher and higher, harder and harder to breathe. She wasn't just pretending to be the wife of a mafia boss. She was inside a war zone. She was a potential target, and for the first time since she stepped into this mansion, Phoebe was truly afraid. Not the vague kind of worry, but the kind that turns your hands cold, twists your stomach, makes you want to run for the door and never come back. She looked at Elijah, and he looked back, waiting for her to say she wanted to leave, waiting for her to demand her suitcase, waiting for her to do what any normal person would do after learning she was being followed by mafia soldiers. You should be afraid. Elijah said it without threat, only naked truth. Phoebe looked at him. Then she looked up toward the ceiling, toward the second floor, where Zoe was sleeping in the room with the plastic key she had given Phoebe, where the little girl believed Phoebe would still be there in the morning, believed it with a fragile faith she had needed an enormous amount of courage to reclaim after being abandoned the first time. I am afraid. But I'm not running. Not yet. Elijah stared at her, and in those steel-gray eyes, Phoebe saw something for the first time that looked like respect. Not the respect he'd give an ally or an enemy in the underworld, but the respect a man gives, a 27-year-old bakery girl who is sitting in his mansion shaking and still refusing to run, because a child upstairs had handed her a plastic key and the last piece of trust she had left. That night, no one could sleep. Phoebe lay in her room with her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound in the mansion, the guards' footsteps as they patrolled the grounds, the static crackle of radios, the wind whistling through a window seam. Every sound could be a stranger's step. One of the shadows from the black sedan she'd seen at the park that afternoon. She thought about her mother lying in the hospital. She thought about the small bakery in Pilsen. She thought about the normal life she'd left less than a week ago, a life that already felt like it belonged to someone else. Then she thought about Zoe, about the small hand clinging to her in the back seat, about the trembling question. Bad people, Miss Phoebe, like in my dream, and she knew she couldn't lie there any longer. Phoebe went down to the kitchen at 1 o'clock in the morning, meaning to make a cup of tea to steady her shaking hands, and found the kitchen lights already on. Elijah sat at the island. In front of him was a freshly poured glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, the ice melting. He wasn't in a suit, only a black t-shirt, his hair slightly messy, and he looked tired in a way Phoebe had never seen before. Not the tiredness of missing sleep, but the tiredness of weight, the kind that sinks into bone and soul, the kind no amount of rest can fix. He looked up when Phoebe came in, not surprised, as if he'd known she'd end up down here sooner or later. Can't sleep either? Phoebe shook her head, poured hot water, dropped a teabag into the mug. She sat across from him. The island was wide between them, the soft yellow overhead light casting their shadows onto the marble. And for the first time since Phoebe stepped into this house, they talked for real. Not through Zoe, not through the fake script, not through conflict or non-disclosure agreements or envelopes of cash. Just two people sitting in a kitchen at 1 in the morning, because both of them were afraid, and neither of them had anyone else to speak to. Phoebe spoke first. She didn't know why. Maybe the darkness and exhaustion loosened the walls a little. Maybe after that afternoon she needed to say something out loud about her real life, the life she'd been hiding since she walked into the mansion. My mother's name is Ruth. She's the strongest person I know. Phoebe stared into her tea, her voice light and slow, as if she were turning pages of memory. My dad died when I was 15. A steel mill accident. My mom got the call while she was kneading dough in the shop. She put the bowl down, wiped her hands on her apron, went to the hospital, handled everything, then came home and cooked dinner for me. She didn't cry until I was asleep. I know because I pretended to sleep, and I heard her crying in the kitchen until 3 in the morning. Phoebe paused. After that, she worked 16 hours a day, up at 4, kneading dough, opening at 6, closing at 8, cleaning until 10, 7 days a week. No holidays, no trips, never bought anything for herself. Everything was for me. Tuition, books, lunch money. She used to tell me, "You just study hard, and I'll handle the rest." Phoebe smiled, a sad smile. Then she got sick, and I left everything. College, friends, every plan. People ask if I regret it. I don't. I'm not afraid of being poor. I'm not afraid of hard work. What I'm afraid of is one day my mother closing her eyes and I never said thank you enough. I never let her know that every loaf of bread she baked at 4 in the morning. I remember it. Elijah didn't speak while Phoebe told her story. He sat still, his whiskey untouched, fingers tapping softly against the stone. When Phoebe finished, he stayed silent for a long time, long enough that Phoebe thought he might say nothing at all. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough, as if these words had been locked in his throat for years and were only now being released. My father's name was Franklin Ashford. He built everything I'm running now, but he wasn't like me. He knew how to laugh. He knew how to hug my mother in the kitchen. He knew how to read to me every night. Elijah looked down at his hands, big hands marked with scars, resting on cold stone. I was 19 when he was shot. Right in front of our house. A black car pulled up. 2 shots. Then it drove away. My mother was at the second-floor window. She saw everything. She ran downstairs, held my father on the sidewalk, blood soaking her dress, and he died in her arms before the ambulance arrived. He stopped, swallowed. My mother changed after that. She became someone else. Hard, cold, controlling everything and everyone. She decided who came into the house, who could see me, what I ate, what I wore, who I married, because she thought if she controlled it tightly enough, held it hard enough, no one would die again. No one would get shot on the front steps again. Phoebe watched him and began to understand Dorothy, the mother-in-law she hadn't met but had heard Elijah mention with a mix of respect and exhaustion. Dorothy wasn't a monster. Dorothy was a woman who had held her husband as he died on a sidewalk and never recovered. And you? Phoebe asked softly. Did you become someone else? Elijah looked at her, and the smile that appeared then held no joy at all, only the bitter irony of a man who could see himself clearly and hated what he saw. I became the man who rebuilt my father's empire, using the same thing that killed him. The sentence dropped into the kitchen like a stone into a well. Heavy, echoing, then swallowed by silence. Phoebe didn't speak. She didn't comfort him. She didn't judge him. She only sat there with both hands around her tea, now cooled, and let the silence exist between them without trying to fill it. Because sometimes silence is the only thing large enough to hold 2 people's pain. They sat like that for a long time. No talking. No need for it. 2 people carrying old wounds. Losing a father at 15 and losing a father at 19. Seeing themselves in each other for the first time. Not through the role of pretend spouses. Not through Zoe. Not through an envelope of money, but through a pain that was strangely the same. The pain of children who lost their fathers too early and spent their lives trying to make up for the mother left behind. Then Phoebe drifted off, her head slowly lowered onto the kitchen island, her hands still wrapped around the mug, her light brown hair spilling onto cold stone. She was exhausted, because last night she'd been up until 3 finishing Zoe's birthday cake design, because that afternoon she'd been pulled out of the park, because tonight she'd learned she was being watched by men with guns, because for a week her body had lived in a constant state of tension it wasn't built to carry. Elijah watched her sleep. He stood, quietly, without a sound. He went to his room, grabbed his jacket, returned to the kitchen, and laid it over Phoebe's shoulders. The jacket was too large for her, falling from her shoulders nearly to her elbows, smelling of men's cologne and leather. He stood there, looking at her asleep on the island, hair loose, face peaceful, and he didn't touch her. He wanted to. He wanted to brush the strand of hair off her cheek. He wanted to lift her up and carry her to a bed so she wouldn't sleep on cold stone, but he didn't, because he knew his hands weren't clean, and she deserved to be touched by cleaner hands than his. He only stood there, watched, and then turned away, and he realized, clearly and brutally, as sharp as the neon brightness of the kitchen light at 2 a.m, that he didn't want her to leave. Not because of Zoe, because of him. Day 7. 1 week since Phoebe walked into this mansion, and she had started to forget the smell of flour in Lawson's bakery. In its place, she had grown used to the expensive fragrance in the hallway, used to the guard's radio chatter after midnight, used to the small footsteps of Zoe running down the stairs every morning to check that Phoebe was still here. And that was the most frightening part. Not the black sedan at the park, not the blood on a sleeve, but the familiarity, the way she was beginning to memorize this house. The way she knew Zoe liked strawberry frosting more than chocolate. The way she knew Elijah drank black coffee with no sugar every morning at 6 o'clock. The way she knew Brennan always stood watch in the corner of the kitchen during dinner, even though no one told him he had to. She was putting down roots in a place she had no right to root into. That night, after Zoe fell asleep, Phoebe went down to the living room and found Elijah already there. 2 glasses of red wine on the table. One poured, one still empty. He looked at her, nudged the bottle toward the empty glass without speaking, inviting her with nothing but his eyes. Phoebe sat, poured herself wine, and they drank in silence for a while. The living room lights were soft, the velvet curtains drawn tight, Chicago at night glittering through a narrow gap. And for a moment, the room didn't feel cold anymore, but Phoebe hadn't come there to drink. "Do you realize?" Phoebe set her glass down and looked straight at Elijah. "This morning Zoe called me to braid her hair. At noon, she pulled me into the playroom. This afternoon, she asked what story I'd read tonight. Before bed, she asked what we're baking tomorrow morning. Phoebe paused. She's loving for real. Every day she's attached to me a little more, trusting me a little more, opening up a little more. And every one of those little pieces, when I leave, will become a cut. Do you understand? Not one cut, dozens of them. Because every good memory will turn into a painful memory when the person who made it disappears. Elijah set his glass down. He looked at Phoebe, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't anger or defense, but the exhaustion of a man who knew she was right and didn't want to face it. Then don't leave. He said it low and calm, as if he were asking her to stay for dinner, instead of asking her to change her entire life. Stay. Phoebe didn't soften. She had expected this. She had known it would come, because she had watched the way Elijah's gaze had changed in the past week, from the calculating look of a mafia boss weighing a piece on the board, to the look of a man growing used to a woman's presence in his home. No, Phoebe's voice was clear, unshakable. If I stay, it has to be a real decision. A decision I make because I want to, not because of the envelope on the register counter that night. Not because you're lonely in a $1 million mansion with 7 cameras and not a single family photograph on the walls. And certainly not because you're used to ordering people around and you think saying stay makes people stay. Elijah set his glass down harder than necessary. The sound of glass on marble rang through the room. His jaw clenched, tendons rising in his neck, and Phoebe watched him fight the instinct not to react the way he was built to react. The instinct to command, to control, to use power to keep what he wanted. But he didn't. He stayed still, looked at her, and when he spoke, there was something in his voice that came close to admiration. You've got guts. Phoebe shook her head. No, I'm just someone with nothing left to lose. I came here with a small suitcase, a failing bakery, and a mother in a hospital bed. There's nothing you can take from me, and there's nothing you can offer me beyond what you already offered. So I can be honest with you, because the person with nothing to lose is the freest person alive. Silence. Long. The living room lights flickered faintly, maybe the wind rattling power lines outside. Phoebe looked at Elijah. Elijah looked at Phoebe, and the air between them shifted. Not the sharp tension of conflict, like the night of the blood-stained sleeve, but a different kind of tension, the kind that happens when two people begin to see each other more clearly than is safe. Elijah's hand rested on the table, less than a palm's width from Phoebe's, and she realized the distance was shrinking. Not because either of them moved, but because the space between them was heating up, pulling them in. His fingers came close to hers, close enough that she could feel warmth radiating off his skin. Phoebe drew her hand back, gently, but firmly. Not yet. Not now. Not while everything was still a performance, while she was still the hired one, while the line between real and fake was so blurred she couldn't even tell which side she was on anymore. Phoebe went back to her room, closed the door, sat on the bed, and picked up her phone. She tapped a video call to her mother, and it took 6 rings, longer than usual, before the screen brightened and Ruth appeared. Her mother lay in a hospital bed, head propped on pillows, an IV line in her arm, skin paler than the last time Phoebe had seen her, but her eyes were still bright, still sharp, still the eyes Phoebe knew could not be lied to. Sweetheart, it's been so long since you called. Mom, how are you feeling? I'm still here. That means I'm doing fine. Ruth smiled, weak but warm. Then she studied the screen and frowned. Where are you? That background isn't the bakery. Phoebe angled the phone away from the velvet curtains and chandelier behind her. But it was too late. I'm at a friend's place, helping her watch a baby for a few weeks. What friend? A new friend. You don't know her. Ruth went quiet, watching her daughter through the screen, her gaze moving from Phoebe's face to the blurred room behind her. And Phoebe knew her mother was reading her the way she'd read her all her life, like a book she knew by heart. Ruth didn't press. She only said, her voice gentle but every word clear, Sweetheart, I know you're hiding something. I don't know exactly what, but I trust you. I trust you won't do anything that harms you. Phoebe bit her lip. I promise, Mom. And remember, no matter what happens, you always have a home to come back to. It's a small bakery, but it's our home. I know, Mom. I love you. I love you. She ended the call. Phoebe sat on the bed, staring at the dark screen and cried. She cried because she missed her mother, because she felt guilty for lying to her, because her mother was alone in a hospital while Phoebe sat in a $1 million mansion drinking wine with a mafia boss. She cried because her mother said, "I trust you," and Phoebe didn't deserve that trust. And she cried because the little girl upstairs was sleeping peacefully, because she believed Phoebe would still be here in the morning, and her mother in the hospital believed her daughter was somewhere safe. 2 acts of faith, both of them wrong. And Phoebe lay in the unfamiliar mansion room, staring up at the strange ceiling, thinking there were 5 days left, 5 days until she would leave, and the child sleeping across the hall would lose another mother. Phoebe woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning on Zoe's birthday, but the truth was she hadn't slept at all. After the call with her mother, after the tears, after the long night staring at the ceiling and counting down the days she had left, she slipped quietly into the kitchen and started baking. She had prepped the ingredients the day before, hiding them in the extra refrigerator the housekeeper rarely opened, and now she laid everything out across the kitchen island, like an artisan, preparing the most important work of her life. Flour, butter, sugar, heavy cream, food coloring, fondant, a silicone castle tower mold she had ordered online 3 days earlier. All week, every time Zoe described her dream cake, Phoebe had stored it, not on paper, but in her mind, every smallest detail. A 3-tier castle, pink towers, yellow frosting trimming the windows, tiny princesses standing around it, a purple flag on the highest tower because purple was Zoe's favorite color, and a castle door that could open, because Zoe had said, "A castle has to have a door that opens so the princess can go inside." Phoebe baked in the dark kitchen, with only the small light above the stove hood turned on, kneading dough, whipping cream, shaping each detail with the kind of patience she had learned from her mother through thousands of early mornings at Lawson's. Ruth used to tell her, "Good cake isn't good because the ingredients are expensive. Good cake is good because the baker pays attention to every layer of dough." And Phoebe paid attention. She put her whole heart into that cake. Every fondant flour she molded by hand, every line of frosting she piped from the bag, every tiny princess she placed around the base of the castle. By 4 o'clock, the cake had taken shape. By 5 o'clock, she finished the last details, stepped back to look, and for the first time all week, she smiled not because she was trying to, but because she was proud. The cake was beautiful, more beautiful than any cake she had ever made at Lawson's, because this cake wasn't made to sell. It was made for a child she loved. At 6 o'clock, Phoebe had just placed the cake into the large refrigerator when she heard small feet pounding up the stairs, fast and urgent, and her bedroom door flew open. Zoe rushed in, jumped onto the empty bed, then looked around in confusion when she didn't see Phoebe. "Miss Phoebe, I'm here." Phoebe ran up from the kitchen, and Zoe spun toward her. Eyes shining, cheeks flushed, hair sticking up, bunny pajamas crooked. "I'm 4, Zoe shouted, jumping down and hugging Phoebe's leg. 4. I'm big now." Then she turned into the hallway and called, "Daddy-ye, are you awake? I'm 4 now." Elijah appeared at the end of the hall, hair messy, eyes still heavy with sleep, wearing a t-shirt and pants, looking nothing like the black-suited mafia boss of ordinary days. Zoe ran to grab his hand, then grabbed Phoebe's hand too, tugging them both toward her room. "Sit here. Daddy and Miss Phoebe. Our family sits here." The 3 of them sat on Zoe's bed, Zoe in the middle, legs dangling, one hand holding her father and the other holding Phoebe. And she laughed bright and full, laughing with her whole face and her whole body, the kind of laugh Phoebe hadn't seen from her since the first day. That moment felt so much like a real family it hurt. 3 people on a small bed, early Chicago sunlight filtering through the curtains, a child laughing between 2 adults, and anyone looking in would see a happy family starting a new day. But Phoebe knew it was a performance. Elijah knew it was a performance. Only Zoe didn't, and that was why it hurt so much. At 9 o'clock, Phoebe brought the cake out of the refrigerator and set it on the dining room table. She called Zoe downstairs, and when the little girl ran into the room, she stopped short in the doorway. Zoe's eyes went wide. Her mouth fell open. Her arms hung at her sides. The 3-tier castle cake stood in the center of the table, the pink towers glittering, yellow frosting outlining every tiny window, princess figures arranged around the base, the purple flag flying at the top, and the castle door opening just enough to reveal a tiny princess inside sitting on a throne, brown hair, pink dress, looking like Zoe. Zoe didn't speak for 10 seconds. Then tears spilled. Not sad tears, but the kind that overflow when a heart receives what it has ached for but never dared believe could be real. "This is the cake I dreamed," Zoe whispered. "How did you know? How did you know I wanted pink towers? How did you know I wanted a purple flag? How did you know the castle door had to open?" Phoebe knelt and smiled, even as her own eyes turned wet. "Because I listened every time you told me." Zoe lunged into Phoebe's arms, small hands around her neck, face pressed into her shoulder, and said in a choked voice, "You're the best person in the whole world." Behind them, Elijah leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and his eyes were red even as he tried to look away. The party started at 2 in the afternoon. The mansion was decorated in pink and silver balloons, tinsel, and the Happy Birthday Zoe banner Phoebe and Zoe had chosen on Michigan Avenue. Classmates arrived with parents, about 12 children running across the lawn, laughter everywhere. But mixed among the normal parents were a few different faces. 3 men in black suits, polite, proper smiles, but sharp eyes and a way of standing with their backs to the wall, always watching the doors, giving them away as not parents at all. Elijah's associates, coming to wish their boss's daughter a happy birthday, and Phoebe realized that even a child's birthday party wasn't free of the Mafia's shadow, that Elijah's world had no days off, no empty spaces where darkness couldn't slip in. Zoe didn't notice. She was radiant with happiness, racing from one game to the next, dragging her friends to show off the castle cake, shouting, "Miss Phoebe made it," to anyone who would listen. Phoebe organized games, painted faces into butterflies and superheroes and princesses. And she did it naturally, because she'd studied early childhood education for 3 years. Because she loved children, because this was work she had been born to do even if life had dragged her elsewhere. But amid the laughter and balloons, Phoebe noticed something no one else saw. Every few minutes, Zoe turned her head to look for her. In the middle of playing, Zoe would pause, eyes sweeping the room until she found Phoebe, and only then would she go back to playing. As if she were checking, confirming, counting each minute Phoebe was still there, afraid that if she didn't look, Phoebe would disappear. A mother standing next to Phoebe while the children ate cake, leaned in and whispered, "Zoe has changed so much. Last year at her birthday party, she sat in a corner and didn't play with anyone, didn't talk, didn't smile. I was worried something was wrong. But look at her today, laughing, running everywhere. What did you do? How are you so good with her?" Phoebe smiled. "I just listened to her." And as she said it, she looked at Zoe laughing among her friends, and her heart felt full and shattered at the same time, because she knew she had brought this change into Zoe's life, and she would be the one to take it away. Then it was time to blow out the candles. The 3-tier castle cake was placed at the center of the table, 4 pink candles set into the highest tower, flames flickering. Everyone sang happy birthday. Zoe stood in front of the cake, eyes squeezed shut, hands clasped at her chest, lips moving as she made her wish. The whole room went quiet, waiting. Then Zoe opened her eyes, drew in a deep breath, blew out all 4 candles, and shouted in a voice that rang through the entire room, "I wish Phoebe stays forever." The room went silent. Zoe's shout echoed through the space, and then fell into a stillness so thick it felt like honey. The parents glanced at one another and smiled, assuming it was the kind of sweet thing children say. A mother cooed, "Oh, that's adorable." A dad laughed and clapped, but Phoebe didn't smile, and neither did Elijah. They looked at each other across a room full of balloons and tinsel, and in both their eyes was the same thing, panic. Because they knew what the other parents didn't, that this wish wasn't a cute, childish line. It was a cry for help. Zoe spoke again, louder now, almost shouting, both hands gripping the edge of the table. "Forever. She can't ever go. Never." And Phoebe looked into Zoe's eyes then. Really looked. And she saw it. Those big brown eyes weren't full of joy. They were full of fear. Fear disguised as a wish. The fear of being abandoned again, dressed up as hope. And Zoe was using her birthday candles like a last life raft, as if wishing hard enough, loud enough times could make it real and keep Phoebe from disappearing. Zoe had blown out the candles, but her eyes never left Phoebe, tracking her through the thin smoke rising from the 4 extinguished wicks, as if she were afraid that if she blinked, Phoebe would be gone. Then a woman's voice cut through the air. "My granddaughter." Dorothy Ashford stood in the dining room doorway, and no one knew when she had arrived. She was tall and thin, posture straight, silver hair cut short and precise, wearing a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, a simple pearl necklace that still radiated a kind of authority money couldn't buy. Her face was beautiful in a cold way. High cheekbones, thin lips, gray eyes exactly like Elijah's but sharper, colder. And beneath them were dark circles no expensive makeup could truly hide. She looked at Zoe. She looked at the castle cake. She looked at the balloons and tinsel. Then she looked at Phoebe. And the way her gaze stopped on Phoebe was like a scalpel, precise and cold, cutting through every outer layer to see straight inside. Her face went pale. Not with fear, with anger. The party slowly dissolved. Parents led their children away, kids clutching favor bags, and the mansion grounds fell quiet again. But Dorothy didn't leave. She sat in the living room, legs crossed, back straight, a cup of tea in front of her untouched. And she waited. She waited until the last child left the house, until Phoebe took Zoe upstairs to change. And then she spoke. "Sit down." She said it to Phoebe in a voice that wasn't loud, but no one would dare disobey. Phoebe sat. Dorothy looked her over from head to toe, slowly, assessing, as if inspecting merchandise before deciding whether to return it. Phoebe Lawson, 27, owner of a small bakery in Pilsen, mother with stage 3 cancer, dropped out in your 3rd year of college. Phoebe went stiff. Dorothy knew everything. Of course she did. She was Dorothy Ashford, mother of the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. And if Brennan had a file on Phoebe, then Dorothy certainly had one too, probably with more detail. A bakery. Dorothy took a sip of tea, set the cup down, porcelain touching saucer with a sound that was soft but sharp. "My son runs an empire, and the girl he chooses to bring into his house sells cookies." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Phoebe wanted to answer, but before she could open her mouth, Dorothy stood, turned her back, and walked toward Elijah's office. "I need to speak with my son. Alone." The office door closed. Phoebe sat alone in the living room, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Inside the office, Dorothy stood in front of Elijah, and for the first time, her steel shell cracked. "Your father died in front of me." Her voice shook, the kind of tremor Phoebe couldn't have imagined in the woman who had sat out there a moment ago, right on the front steps of this house. On the sidewalk you walk past every day. I held your father in my arms, blood soaking into my dress, and he closed his eyes before I could say goodbye. Because of this world, the world your father built, and you keep alive. Dorothy stepped forward and placed her hand on Elijah's desk, right beside the Beretta in the drawer she knew was there. Vanessa ran because she was afraid. She had reason to be afraid. I don't blame her. Any woman with sense would run from this house. She looked straight into her son's eyes. "Now you bring in an ordinary girl, a bakery girl with no powerful family, no connections, no one to protect her. And when she learns the truth, when she sees blood on your sleeve, when she understands she's living in a war zone, she'll run too. Just like Vanessa. And Zoe will lose another mother." Dorothy opened her purse, pulled out a thick envelope of documents, and set it on the desk in front of Elijah. "I checked. There's no marriage license between you and Phoebe Lawson. Not in Illinois. Not in any state. She worked at Lawson's Bakery until 4 days before she appeared in your house. It's all fake. I don't know how much you're paying her, but I know this is a farce." Elijah stayed silent, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the thick envelope without opening it. Dorothy wasn't finished. She lowered her voice, and now it wasn't cold. It was heavy, heavy with the real fear of a woman who had lost her husband and was terrified of losing her grandchild. "Marco Salerno is watching you. I have my own sources, you know that. His men have been seen near your house, near Zoe's school, near the park where you let that girl take my granddaughter with only one guard following." Dorothy emphasized one as if it were a crime. He used that exact play on Vanessa. Surveillance, photos, threats, until she broke and ran. "Do you want history to repeat itself?" Elijah still didn't speak. Dorothy stepped closer, her voice dropping almost to a whisper, but every word carved cleanly as stone. "That girl has to go. Today. She can never see Zoe again. Or I will use everything I have, and you know what I have, to take Zoe out of this house." Dorothy left the mansion 10 minutes after the conversation in the office, her black car gliding through the iron gate and vanishing into the Chicago night. But her threat stayed behind, heavy and thick, settling over the house like ash after a fire. Elijah remained in his office for another half an hour, alone, the door shut, and when he finally opened it and stepped out, His face was nothing like the face he'd carried in. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the cold mask of a mafia boss. It was the face of a man driven to the wall with nowhere left to back up. He found Phoebe in the living room. She had been sitting there since Dorothy ordered her out, hands resting on her thighs, spine straight, waiting for what she knew was coming, not knowing how much it would hurt. Elijah sat across from her and told her. He told her everything. No hiding. No choosing what to keep back. No soft wrapping. He told her about Dorothy, about the thick envelope of documents proving the whole thing was fake, about the threat to take Zoe out of the house if Phoebe didn't leave immediately. He told her about Marco Salerno, about Dorothy's sources confirming Marco's men were watching the mansion, about the real danger Phoebe faced every day she stayed here. Then he told her what he had never told anyone except Brennan, what he had held in his chest for 3.5 years like a bullet that could not be removed. Vanessa didn't simply leave. His voice was low and slow, as if every word carried its own weight, and he had to push each one out of his throat. She was threatened. Marco sent her a photo of Zoe in a stroller at the park, with a message, "Leave or the baby pays the price." She didn't tell me. She knew that if she did, I would answer with war, and war would put Zoe in the middle. So she decided on her own. She left to protect our daughter. Phoebe sat perfectly still, and she felt the room tilt. Not dizziness, but the sensation of everything she thought she knew about this story being flipped upside down. Zoe thinks her mother left because she didn't love her. She thinks she was the reason her mother went away, but the truth is her mother left because she loved her. Elijah nodded, and that small motion looked like it drained the last of his strength. And I haven't dared tell Zoe, because if I tell her the truth, if I explain that her mother was threatened by my enemy, that she had to run because my world is too dangerous, then my daughter will know what kind of man her father is. She'll understand it wasn't her mother abandoning her. It was her father driving her mother away, with the life I chose. He looked at Phoebe, and she saw him then not as the boss, not as Elijah Ashford the whole city feared, but as a father being crushed by the consequences of his own life, carrying a brutal secret to protect the only image his daughter still had of him, the image of the strongest man in the world, when the truth was he was the source of every loss. I'm telling you because you deserve to know, because you've been here nearly 10 days. You've given my daughter more than anyone has since Vanessa left, and you have a right to know why you should be afraid. Phoebe looked at him, and in her mind the pieces clicked into a complete picture. The black sedan at the park, the security cameras everywhere, Brennan always trailing close, the office door always locked, Zoe's nightmares about bad people and her father fighting. None of it was the caution of a rich man. It was the defense of someone living in a war zone, and she, Phoebe Lawson, the bakery girl from Pilsen, was standing in the middle of that war zone with the 3-year-old child she loved. Silence stretched. Phoebe looked down at her hands, the fingertips still dusted with fondant from the castle cake that morning, and she thought of Zoe, of the birthday wish shouted across the room, of the big brown eyes that hadn't left her for even a minute. Then she lifted her head, looked Elijah straight in the face, and spoke in a calm voice that surprised even her. "I'll go." Elijah closed his eyes. "Not because your mother is forcing it. Dorothy can threaten whatever she wants. I'm not afraid of her." Phoebe paused. "I'm leaving because every day I stay, I love Zoe more. And Zoe loves me more. Every morning she checks that I'm still here. Every night she brings me a brush and asks me to braid her hair. Every day she says my name one more time, and each time is another thread tying us together. When I leave, every thread becomes a cut, and if I stay another week, another 2 weeks, another month, those cuts will be so deep she'll never heal. I have to stop now." She stood. "Give me one last day. Tomorrow. Let me be with Zoe one more day without crying in front of her." The last day. Phoebe woke to Zoe jumping onto the bed, hair wild, eyes bright. "What are we doing today?" Phoebe smiled, the most painful smile of her life, and said, "We're going out." All that day Phoebe pretended everything was normal, pretended so well she almost believed it herself. They ate breakfast. They made heart-shaped cookies. Zoe got flour all over her nose and giggled. But in the middle of laughing, Zoe suddenly stopped and tilted her head, looking at Phoebe with eyes far too old for her age. "Are you sad?" Phoebe swallowed. "No. Why do you think that? Your mouth is smiling but your eyes are sad. I can tell." A 3-year-old looking straight through a mask the whole adult world would have missed. Phoebe knelt and kissed Zoe's forehead. "I'm just a little tired, that's all. Want to go to the park this afternoon? That afternoon, Brennan drove them to the park, and this time there were 2 security vehicles following behind after the black sedan incident. Phoebe and Zoe sat in the grass picking dandelions, and Phoebe taught Zoe how to weave a flower crown. Small, clumsy fingers threaded the stems together, tongue sticking out in concentration, and when the crown was finished, crooked and loose but the first one Zoe had ever made herself, she placed it on Phoebe's head. "Flower Queen," Zoe shouted, laughing. Phoebe laughed too, but tears hovered behind her lashes, and she tried not to blink because she was afraid they would fall. She held Zoe, held her tight, memorizing everything, the strawberry shampoo in Zoe's hair, the weight of a tiny hug that squeezed the air out of her, the sound of laughter drifting through the Chicago afternoon, the warmth of a small hand holding hers. She memorized it all, because after today, memory was the only thing she would be allowed to take with her. "Miss Phoebe." "Yes, sweetheart? I love you. I love you too." Zoe lifted her face, eyes bright, and asked in a soft, hopeful voice, as if asking the most obvious thing in the world, "Then you're staying, right?" Phoebe didn't answer. She couldn't, because any word she spoke would be a lie or a blade. Zoe looked at her, waited, and then those big brown eyes slowly changed. The light in them faded, like a candle running out of wick, and she understood. She read the answer in Phoebe's silence the same way she'd read the sadness in her eyes that morning, because this child had learned how to read adults long before she ever learned to read words. Zoe stayed silent the entire drive back. She didn't ask anything else. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only sat in the back seat, turned toward the window, arms tight around her stuffed bear. And that silence was more frightening than any question, because it was the silence of a child who already knew the ending and no longer had the strength to beg. Night. The mansion was silent like the tomb Phoebe had once called it. Zoe had fallen asleep after the long day at the park, exhausted from playing and from a sadness she could feel but couldn't name. Phoebe closed her bedroom door, pulled her small suitcase out from under the bed, the same suitcase she'd brought here 10 days earlier, with a few changes of clothes and a box of heart-shaped cookies. She opened it and began to pack. Her hands were shaking. Not from cold, not from fear, but because her body knew what her mind had decided hours ago. She was leaving a child she loved. She folded a t-shirt and placed it in the suitcase, then folded the next one, and the first tear dropped onto the fabric, spreading into a dark round stain on the white cotton. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and kept folding, but the tears kept falling. Onto the clothes, onto the rim of the suitcase, falling soundlessly because she bit down on her lip until it bled so she wouldn't sob out loud and wake Zoe. But Zoe heard anyway, not the crying, the sound of the zipper. Phoebe's door opened, soft and slow, and when Phoebe turned, Zoe was standing there, tiny in bunny pajamas, clutching her worn stuffed bear, hair tousled, eyes heavy with sleep. But those big brown eyes were fixed on the suitcase on the bed, on the neatly folded clothes inside, on Phoebe's shoes lined up by the door, and she understood, immediately, with the instinct of a child who had seen this once before, when Vanessa packed a suitcase in the middle of the night and disappeared before morning. "Are you leaving?" Zoe's voice was as small as breath, so small Phoebe almost didn't hear it, small because the child was using every bit of strength to keep her voice from breaking. Phoebe knelt, and she didn't know what to say except the truth. "Tomorrow. I have to leave tomorrow." Zoe's face crumpled, not slowly. In an instant, like a wall that had held too much weight for too long, finally collapsing. Her mouth trembled, her chin shook, her eyes reddened, her whole small face twisting as she tried to hold it in and couldn't. "What did I do wrong?" Zoe's voice broke, tears spilling. "Tell me, what did I do wrong? I'll be better. I promise. I won't break eggs anymore. I won't have nightmares anymore. I won't ask anyone to braid my hair anymore. I promise I'll be good. Please." Phoebe went rigid. Every sentence Zoe said was a blade cutting into her chest. Not just because it hurt, but because it revealed what this 3-year-old believed. That grown-ups leave because the child is at fault. That if she is better, quieter, less trouble, then her mother will stay. "You didn't do anything wrong, Zoe. Listen to me. You never did anything wrong. Then why?" Zoe screamed, the sound tearing through the mansion's silence, echoing down the hallway, echoing to the floor below. She threw herself at Phoebe, small arms locking around Phoebe's legs, face pressed into Phoebe's knees, her whole body shaking. Don't leave like the other mom. Please. Miss Phoebe, please. Don't go. She cried until she couldn't breathe. Short, fast, broken gasps. The kind of crying children do when they're so scared their bodies can't control it anymore. Heavy footsteps pounded on the stairs. Elijah ran to the doorway and froze at the sight of his daughter clinging to Phoebe's legs and crying as if the world were ending. He stepped forward and dropped to his knees. Zoe, sweetheart, calm down. But Zoe wouldn't let go. She held tighter, small fingers digging into Phoebe's pant leg until her knuckles turned white. If I let go, you'll disappear. Like the other mom. The other mom left when I was asleep. If I don't let go, then you can't go. Phoebe knelt and peeled Zoe's hands away from her legs, gently, but each finger she loosened felt like she was pulling it off her own heart. She gathered Zoe into her arms, and the little girl curled into her and sobbed into Phoebe's chest, trembling all over. Why do all the moms leave me? That question. Again, the same question Zoe had asked her father in the SUV the first day, and now she asked it again, but worse, because the first time she asked because she didn't understand. This time she asked because she understood far too well. Phoebe looked at Elijah. Elijah looked at her. And Phoebe decided to tell the truth. Zoe, listen to me. Your dad asked me to come here and pretend to be your mom, like a game, so you could have a mom at your birthday party. Zoe stopped crying, not because the pain eased, but because shock took her breath. She lifted her face, eyes drenched, and stared at Phoebe. Pretend, but the love is real. The love I feel for you is real. Every time I braided your hair, every cake I made for you, every night I held you while you slept, all of it was real. Zoe blinked. Then she turned and looked at her father, those big brown eyes fixed on him with a look Elijah would remember until he died. You lied to me. Elijah nodded. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He didn't say, I did it for you. He only nodded, because any more words would have insulted his daughter's pain. Zoe stepped back out of Phoebe's arms, back away from her father, back until her small shoulders hit the wall, and her face changed. Tears still ran, but her mouth pressed into a hard line, her hands clenched around her stuffed bear, and the glassy, pleading stare that had been begging a moment ago now burned with anger, raw and pure and brutal, the anger of a child who had just learned the two people she trusted most in the world had deceived her. I hate both of you. Zoe screamed, hoarse from crying, then turned and ran into her room, slamming the door so hard the hallway picture frames rattled. Phoebe ran after her and knocked. Zoe, please let me explain. Go away. You're just acting. You're such a good actor. Go away. Zoe's voice came from behind the door, mixed with strangled sobs, the thud of a stuffed bear thrown against the wall, the clatter of something knocked over. Phoebe rested her forehead against the wooden door, tears sliding down her face, and she knew she couldn't open that door anymore, even though the little plastic key was still in her pocket. 15 minutes later, Phoebe dragged her suitcase to the front door. Brennan was already waiting by the SUV. No one had told him, but he knew, because Brennan always knew. Phoebe crossed the foyer, crossed the living room where she'd once drunk red wine with Elijah, crossed the kitchen where she and Zoe had cracked eggs and made pancakes, crossed every memory from 10 short days that felt as long as a lifetime, and she didn't look back, because if she did, she wouldn't be able to keep walking. Brennan opened the car door. Phoebe climbed into the back seat, her suitcase beside her. The door shut, the vehicle rolled forward. The iron gate opened, and then closed behind them, and Phoebe shattered. She cried, not silently like before, but out loud, with her whole body, shoulders shaking, hands gripping her bag, face pressed to the cold window glass. Brennan drove through the Chicago night, glanced in the rearview mirror, saw the 27-year-old bakery girl sobbing in the back of his car, and for the first time in his hardened life, he didn't know what to say. So he only drove slowly, drove through street after street toward Pilsen, giving her a little more time before she had to step out and face a life without Zoe. Back in the Lincoln Park mansion, Elijah sat on the floor of Zoe's room. Zoe had cried herself into exhaustion and lay curled on her bed, eyes swollen, still clutching her stuffed bear, her breathing still hitching softly, even as she slept. Elijah held his daughter, pressed his cheek to the top of her head, and looked down at the floor. The discarded yellow trinket lay tossed under the bed. Zoe had thrown it away, and beside that key, the drawing with 3 stick figures, the woman in the purple dress and red shoes, had been torn clean in half. On the first day after Phoebe left, Zoe didn't cry. She woke up, looked at the empty bed in the living room where Phoebe had slept, looked at the closet that was now bare, looked at the kitchen island with no trace of flour in the air, then sat down in the corner of her room, hugged her stuffed bear, and said nothing. Not one word. Elijah called her down for breakfast. Zoe didn't answer. He carried her to the kitchen, set a plate of pancakes in front of her that the housekeeper had made. But the housekeeper's pancakes weren't like Phoebe's. There was no smiling face drawn in frosting, no laughter while flipping them, no familiar smell, and Zoe stared at the plate and turned her head away. On the second day, the third, the fourth, the fifth, Zoe still didn't speak. She moved through the mansion like a small shadow, eyes empty, not crying, not smiling, not asking, not wanting. She started wetting the bed, something Elijah thought she'd stopped doing more than a year ago. She started sucking her thumb, the habit the pediatrician had said was a sign of psychological regression, when a child returns to behaviors from an earlier stage because the present is too much to bear. Every night Elijah went to her room and found Zoe sitting on the bed staring at the wall, not out the window, not at her toys, not at anything at all, only at the white wall in front of her with eyes he didn't recognize. Eyes that had gone dark, eyes that had lost the light Phoebe had spent 10 days coaxing into existence, and one night had extinguished. He knelt in front of her, reached for her hand, but Zoe pulled away, not angry, worse than angry, indifferent. A child who had pulled every feeling inward, shut every door, locked every lock, even the little plastic lock she had already thrown away. On the fifth day, Elijah sat beside her bed and tried to read a princess story, the worn book he'd been reading to her every night. But Zoe turned her face to the wall and spoke her first words after 5 days of silence. "I don't need a mom anymore. I don't need anyone." Zoe's voice was even and flat, without emotion. The voice of a 4-year-old who had decided to stop hoping because hope only led to pain. Elijah sat there, staring at his daughter's back, and he understood he wasn't losing her to death or to an enemy. He was losing her to life, to the way she was disconnecting from the world, building a wall inside herself, at an age when the only thing she should have worried about was which doll wore which dress. The second week was worse. Zoe began refusing to eat, not skipping meals because she wasn't hungry, but refusing, pushing the plate away, turning her face aside, clamping her mouth shut when the housekeeper tried to feed her. Her small body, already slight, began thinning visibly, hollow cheeks, smaller arms and legs, her collarbones rising under the bunny pajamas. On the 10th day, Elijah called a doctor to the house. The doctor examined Zoe, checked her heart rate, looked into her eyes, pinched her skin to test for dehydration, then pulled Elijah into the hallway. "She's severely dehydrated, exhausted, and needs fluids immediately. Physically, we can treat that, but the problem isn't physical." The doctor looked at Elijah in a way Elijah could read clearly. "You're her father. You're supposed to know where the real problem is." The IV needle went into Zoe's tiny hand. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She only watched the needle pierce her skin with blank eyes, as if bodily pain was nothing compared to what hurt inside. Dorothy came to visit her granddaughter that afternoon. She stepped into Zoe's room, perfect as always, posture straight, chin high. But when she saw her granddaughter lying on the bed, gaunt, eyes sunken, IV in her hand, the clear tubing running from that tiny arm to the fluid bag hanging above, Dorothy froze. Her legs buckled. Dorothy Ashford, the woman who controlled everything, the woman who watched her husband die and still stayed standing, the woman who had ordered Phoebe out without a tremor in her voice, dropped to her knees beside the bed, placed her hand over Zoe's other hand, the one without the needle, and cried, for the first time. Tears ran down her cheeks, through her makeup, down onto her pearls, and she whispered in a shattered voice Elijah had never heard, I'm sorry, sweetheart." Zoe didn't react. She looked at her grandmother with empty eyes, not angry, not forgiving, nothing at all. Dorothy stood, pulled Elijah into the hallway, gripped her son's hand, and said in the kind of voice she hadn't used since the day Franklin died, "Bring her back. I was wrong. Bring her back before I lose my granddaughter." At the same time, at Lawson's bakery, Phoebe was living in her own private hell. She returned to the shop the morning after she left the mansion, unlocked the door, turned on the ovens, kneaded dough, did everything by the habits of 10 years. But her hands shook. She forgot to add salt. She forgot a tray in the oven until the smell of burning hit her. Yanked the door open and found the pastries blackened. She stood staring at the ruined tray and broke down crying in the middle of the kitchen, crying out of control, while Aunt Janet ran in and held her without understanding what had happened. At night, Phoebe couldn't sleep. She lay in the small room behind the bakery, staring at the low ceiling, and missed Zoe, missed the laughter when they cracked eggs, missed the strawberry shampoo, missed the words, "You're the best person in the world," missed the little plastic key she still carried in her coat pocket. She lost weight. Dark circles deepened under her eyes. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't pipe frosting in a straight line. On the 12th day, Phoebe went to the hospital to see her mother. Ruth lay in bed weaker than during their last video call, skin so translucent the blue veins showed beneath, but her eyes were still sharp, still bright, still the kind of eyes no one could hide anything from. Ruth watched her daughter walk into the room, hollow-eyed, thinner, eyes swollen from crying, and she didn't ask, "Are you okay?" because she already knew the answer. She only said, "Tell me the truth." Phoebe sat in the chair beside the bed, took her mother's hand, and told her everything. From the night Elijah knocked on the bakery door, to the envelope of cash, to the cold mansion, to Zoe and the drawing with 3 stick figures, to the heart cookies and the plastic key, to Dorothy and Marco Salerno, and the blood on the sleeve, to the last night when Zoe clung to her legs and screamed, "Don't leave like the other mom." She told it all, without hiding, without filtering, and when she finished, Phoebe cried in front of her mother for the first time since her father died. Ruth was quiet for a long time. She held Phoebe's hand, her own fingers thin and weak but gripping tightly. Then she spoke, slow, each word carrying the weight of someone who knows she has little time left and that every sentence must matter. "I'm going to die. I know it. I've accepted it. I've lived long enough to raise you, to see you become a good person. And I'm grateful for every day." She paused, breathing, the oxygen tubing trembling softly. "What I won't accept is you living in guilt. You leaving behind a child you love to take care of me, and then after I'm gone, carrying that regret for the rest of your life. I can't bear that." Phoebe tightened her mother's hand. "I needed the money for your treatment. If I go back there, if I leave the bakery, I won't have income. I won't be able to pay the hospital bills. I'll die." Ruth smiled, tired but calm in a way that was almost frightening. "Sweetheart, I'm going to die whether we have money or not. Stage 3 cancer doesn't ask for your bank balance. Money only buys more time. And what does that time mean if my daughter is miserable because of it?" Phoebe's phone buzzed at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 14th day. She was sitting in the kitchen of Lawson's, a tray of cookies in front of her. Cookies she'd baked at 4 o'clock because she couldn't sleep. 4 o'clock, the way her mother used to wake up to knead dough every day. Only unlike her mother, Phoebe wasn't baking to sell. She was baking, so her hands would have something to do instead of shaking. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. But when she picked up, the voice on the other end wasn't unknown. "Miss Lawson," Brennan's voice. Low, steady, as emotionless as always. But there was something else in it, something Phoebe had never heard from that hardened 40-year-old bodyguard. It was close to helplessness. "I'm calling, not because my boss told me to. He doesn't know I'm calling." A brief pause. "She hasn't eaten for 5 days. The doctor gave her fluids, but she pulled the needle out herself. 3 times. We had to tape it down again. She won't talk to anyone. Not to her father, not to her grandmother, not to me. She sits and stares at the wall from morning to night." Brennan stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice changed, lower, almost a whisper. "I've been with him for 15 years. I've seen things worse than death. But I've never seen anything worse than her eyes right now. She looks, and she doesn't see anything. Like the lights went out." He hung up. No more words, no pleading, no suggestion. Brennan only delivered the truth and left Phoebe to decide, because he understood this decision had to be hers, not anyone else's. Phoebe set the phone down. She sat in the empty bakery, yellow light spilling over the old wooden tables her mother had wiped down every night for 20 years. She looked at the photograph on the wall, Ruth young and smiling beside the pastry case, and she heard her mother's voice again from yesterday afternoon on the hospital bed. "I don't need you to sacrifice your happiness just to keep me alive a few more months. That little girl needs you, and you need her," Ruth had added, her voice weak but every word razor clear. You think you're sacrificing yourself for me, but the truth is you're hiding. You're hiding because you're afraid. Afraid to love and then lose. Afraid to step into that child's life and then have to leave again. But sweetheart, I spent my whole life afraid of losing you. Afraid I couldn't raise you. Afraid the bakery would collapse. Afraid of 100 things. And I still stayed, because love isn't the absence of fear. Love is being afraid and staying anyway. Phoebe stood up. She stood in the middle of Lawson's, the place her parents had built with their hands, the place she'd grown up in the smell of melting butter, the place she'd chosen to return to in order to save her mother. And now she was standing here, safe, familiar, and suffocatingly empty, because somewhere else a 4-year-old was pulling out IV needles and staring at a wall with eyes that had gone dark. She picked up her phone. She called Elijah. He answered after the first ring, as if he'd been holding the phone and waiting for something he didn't dare hope for. "I'm coming back," Phoebe said. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't hesitate. She'd hesitated enough through the 14 days of hell behind her. "Not for money. You can keep that envelope. Not because you called, because you didn't call. Not out of guilt or pity. I'm coming back because I'm choosing Zoe, because I promised myself I won't be the next adult who abandons her." Silence on the other end of the line. Phoebe could hear Elijah's breathing, heavy, uneven, and she knew he was forcing something down in his throat. Then he spoke, his voice rough. "This time I won't let anyone threaten you. Not Dorothy, not Marco, not anyone. I don't need you to protect me. I need you to be honest. With me, with Zoe, with yourself. No more fake scripts. No more non-disclosure agreements. No more envelopes. If I come back, I'm coming back with the truth, and you'll have to live with that truth." Okay, one word. But Phoebe heard more than agreement in it. She heard surrender. The surrender of a man who was used to controlling everything, finally accepting there was something he couldn't control, and that something was a 27-year-old bakery girl, calling him at 6 a.m. and saying, "I choose," instead of, "I agree." That afternoon, Elijah drove Zoe to Pilsen. Not in the usual black SUV. He drove an ordinary car, no escort, just Brennan in the front seat. Zoe sat in the back, thin, pale, eyes sunken, her stuffed bear clutched to her chest, staring out the window with eyes that didn't take anything in. She didn't ask where they were going. She'd stopped asking anything days ago. The car stopped in front of Lawson's. Elijah opened the door, lifted Zoe out, and guided her into the shop. The wind chime over the door rang softly, and the smell of butter and vanilla rolled out, and Zoe looked up. Phoebe stood behind the register, white apron on, hair tied back in a ponytail, eyes swollen, but fixed on Zoe. Zoe froze. Her whole body went rigid, both hands tightening around the bear, eyes widening, and for the first time in 2 weeks, her face showed something. But it wasn't joy. It was fear, pure fear. The fear of a child who had been tricked once and no longer dared to believe. "You'll leave again." Zoe's voice was small, hoarse from days without speaking. "You'll come back, and then you'll go again, like last time." Phoebe stepped out from behind the counter, knelt on the bakery's tile floor, lowered herself to Zoe's eye level, exactly the way she'd knelt the first time in the mansion living room with the box of heart-shaped cookies. "You have every right to be mad at me. You have every right not to trust me. I deserve your anger, because I promised with my actions and then I left. But this time, Zoe, this time, it's real. I'm not here because your dad paid me. I'm not here because anyone forced me. I'm here because I'm choosing you." Zoe stared at Phoebe, those big brown eyes still afraid, still doubtful. But underneath the fear, something stirred, something Phoebe thought had died but had only been hiding, waiting, testing whether it was safe to come out again. "I love you," Zoe whispered. "But I'm mad at you too, both at the same time. I don't know how." Phoebe smiled, tears running down her face, but the smile was real. "I can take both. You can love me and be mad at me at the same time. I'm here to hold both." Zoe stood still for a moment, then she took one step forward, then another, and then she rushed into Phoebe's arms. Not the frantic clinging hug from the night by the suitcase, but a trembling, fragile, gentle hug. The hug of a child choosing to believe one more time even though she knows it might hurt. Phoebe wrapped her arms around Zoe, felt how much lighter she was, thinner, all bone compared to 14 days ago. And she held her tight, as if she could make up for the 14 days she hadn't been there by the strength of her arms now. Then Phoebe reached behind the counter, took the familiar paper box, and opened it. Inside were heart-shaped cookies, pale pink frosting, dusted with powdered sugar, the same as the first ones she'd brought to the mansion the day Zoe met her. Zoe looked at them. She took one, bit into it, chewed slowly, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Still good," she said, mouth full of cookie, tears dropping onto the pink frosting, and with her other hand she took Phoebe's hand. The hand was small, thinner than before, but it held tight. It didn't let go. Phoebe moved into the mansion that afternoon, but this time, she didn't bring a small suitcase the way she had the first time. She brought 2 suitcases, one filled with clothes, and one filled with her mother's baking tools, the heart-shaped molds, the oak rolling pin Ruth had used since the day she opened the shop, the old apron embroidered with the name Lawson's, its thread faded with years. She brought those things because this time she wasn't coming to stay temporarily. She was coming to stay, and she wanted this cold, echoing mansion to smell like butter and flour, to carry the imprint of that little bakery in Pilsen, to hold a piece of Ruth in the kitchen where she would cook for Zoe every day. She had barely set her suitcases down in the room when she heard a car pull up outside the gate. Dorothy had arrived. Phoebe braced for a confrontation, for the icy stare and the threats. But the woman who stepped through the front door wasn't the Dorothy Phoebe had met before. Dorothy was still dressed to perfection, still wearing her pearl necklace, still holding her back straight and her chin high, but something in her eyes had broken and been mended with a different kind of glue, a glue made from the image of her granddaughter lying there with an IV. Those empty eyes, a memory she would never be able to erase. Dorothy looked at Phoebe, looked at the 2 suitcases, looked at the baking tools laid out on the kitchen island, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she sat down in the living room chair, not upright and controlled the way she had before, but heavily, like someone carrying a weight too large to set down. "I lost my husband to this world." Dorothy's voice was low, not trembling, not cold either, hovering in the space where real feeling lives. "Franklin died right in front of my house. I held him in my arms, his blood soaked into my skin, and from that day on I swore I'd never let anyone in my family get hurt again. I controlled everything. I pushed everyone out. I thought if I held tight enough, we'd be safe." She looked down at her hands, diamond rings flashing on fingers that trembled just slightly. Then I saw Zoe lying in that bed, so thin I could count her ribs through her nightgown, looking at me without seeing me. And I understood that I, the one who wanted to protect her the most, was the one who nearly killed her. I'm afraid of losing her. I'm still afraid. Phoebe sat across from Dorothy and looked at her with eyes that weren't afraid anymore, and weren't angry either, because she had understood Dorothy ever since that night Elijah talked about Franklin on the sidewalk and the wife who held her dying husband in her arms. Dorothy wasn't a monster. She was a woman whose grief had turned her into a fortress, and that fortress had trapped the very people she loved. "Zoe doesn't need another protector," Phoebe said, her voice gentle but clear. "She's got a father. She's got Uncle Brennan. She's got iron gates and cameras and bodyguards. What she's missing is something no one in this house has been able to give her. She needs someone to love her. The kind of love that braids her hair every morning. The kind that cracks eggs and makes a mess and laughs. The kind that holds her in the middle of the night when a nightmare comes." Dorothy watched Phoebe, her head tilted slightly, those sharp gray eyes weighing her in a new way, not measuring an enemy, but measuring a possible ally. "Can you live in this world? You know what this world is now. Blood on a sleeve, secrets behind locked doors, enemies watching. Can you look at those things every day and still stay?" Phoebe didn't hesitate. "I didn't choose Elijah's world. I chose Zoe. Whatever comes with it, I'll learn how to live in it, because she's lived in it for 4 years without anyone holding her hand." Dorothy fell silent. For a long time, then she nodded. A small nod, not warm, not open, but carrying something Phoebe recognized as respect, the kind of respect Dorothy Ashford gave to very few people. "If you leave again, I won't forgive you." Her voice was even, her gaze steady. It wasn't a threat. Phoebe understood. It was a promise from a grandmother who had knelt and wept beside her granddaughter's bed for the first time in her life, who had seen the consequences of her own decisions, and who wouldn't allow it to happen again no matter the cost. Dorothy stood, smoothed her jacket, gathered her authority back around her like a cloak, and walked toward the door. Before she left, she stopped, didn't turn around, and added one more sentence. The birthday cake was beautiful. My granddaughter deserved a cake like that. Then she was gone. Phoebe watched the black car disappear beyond the gate and understood that it was the only praise Dorothy Ashford would give her for a long time. But it was enough. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Phoebe found a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma, and Zoe began seeing the therapist twice a week. There were good days. Days when Zoe laughed, baked, let Phoebe braid her hair. But there were bad days too. And the bad days arrived without warning, like a storm breaking open under a sunny sky. One afternoon, Phoebe was cleaning the kitchen after the two of them had made cookies when Zoe suddenly stopped, her face flushed, her hand clenched tight around a mold, and she screamed, "You're not my real mom. You're just someone Dad hired. My real mom left me. You'll leave too." Then she threw the mold onto the floor, ran into her room, and slammed the door. Phoebe stood in the kitchen with flour on her apron, the baking mold rolling near her feet, and she took a deep breath. She didn't chase after Zoe. She didn't knock right away. She waited. The therapist had warned her, when Zoe explodes, give her space. Don't force it. Don't answer with your own emotions. Let her learn that anger won't make adults leave. Phoebe waited 10 minutes. Then she went to Zoe's door and knocked softly. "Zoe, I'm out here." Silence inside. "You're right. Legally, I'm not your mother yet. I didn't give birth to you. I wasn't with you from the first day. I came later. I came too late, and I left once." Silence. But Phoebe could hear breathing on the other side of the door, Zoe sitting close to it, listening. "But I want to be your mom. Not because anyone hired me. Not because anyone forced me. Because I want to. Because every morning when I wake up, the first thing I think about is whether you slept well. And every night before I sleep, the last thing I do is check whether your blanket is tucked in." The lock clicked softly. The door opened a crack. Zoe stood in the gap, eyes red, nose red, a stuffed animal pinned under her chin. "What if you change your mind?" Phoebe knelt down, held her hand out in front of Zoe, palm up, and spoke slowly. "This hand will hold you when you're scared. It'll wipe your tears when you cry. It'll braid your hair every morning. It'll pull your blanket up every night. It'll hold your hand when we cross the street. It'll clap when you do something new. Every day. Forever." Zoe stared at that hand. A hand dusted with flour. A small burn mark from the oven. Nails cut short. No polish. The hand of a baker, of a caretaker, of someone who stays. She looked for a long time, then she placed her graying hand on Phoebe's. Lightly, hesitantly. "But there. I'm trying to believe," Zoe said, her voice small. Phoebe smiled through tears and closed her fingers gently around that little hand in her palm. "That's enough." 6 months later, on a June morning, Lawson's Bakery was closed, not because business was slow, but because today the shop was hosting a wedding. Phoebe chose this place instead of a church, instead of the mansion, instead of any luxurious restaurant Elijah's money could have rented, because this was where everything began, where the Mafia boss knocked on the door at 10 o'clock at night, where the white envelope lay on the cash register, where she leaned her back against the door after he left and decided to trade 2 weeks of her life to save her mother, never imagining she would trade her heart as well. The shop was small, but this morning it looked like a dream. Aunt Janet and Phoebe had been awake since 3 o'clock in the morning decorating. White flowers and yellow flowers arranged among the glass pastry cases that still held baked goods as they did every day, because Phoebe wanted it that way, wanted guests to the wedding to still smell vanilla butter mixed with rose, still see heart-shaped cookies neatly lined up in the cases, still know this was a bakery before it was a wedding venue, and that it would remain a bakery after the ceremony ended. Strings of small lights crossed the ceiling. Old wooden tables were covered with white cloths. Chairs were arranged in 2 rows facing the cash register, where a small flower-covered podium now stood. And on the wall, the photograph of Ruth when she was young, smiling beside the pastry case on opening day, still hung in its old place, because Phoebe hadn't taken it down. Her father had been in this shop from the very first day, and today he was still here, through the photograph, through the old bricks, through the oak rolling pin his hands once held. Ruth sat in a wheelchair in the front row, right beside the aisle between the 2 rows of chairs. She was thinner than 6 months ago, her skin almost translucent, a light oxygen tube resting beneath her nose. But she was here. Here. Those 2 words were everything that mattered. The nurse accompanying her stood behind the wheelchair, but Ruth didn't need reminding to sit upright. She straightened herself. She smiled on her own, the first smile Phoebe had seen on her mother's lips in months, a weak but radiant smile, the smile of a mother watching her daughter happy and knowing she had been right to push her forward. Dorothy sat beside Ruth. Two women who'd never met before today, two mothers from different worlds, one who baked 16 hours a day to raise her child, one who controlled an empire from behind a throne, but both knew the smell of blood, the smell of loss, the fear of losing the ones they loved. Dorothy held Ruth's hand, gently, silently, without words. Ruth squeezed back. No words were needed. Two mothers sat side by side, holding hands, and that was enough. Brennan stood guard at the bakery door. Black suit, earpiece, radio, professional as always. But Phoebe noticed his eyes were slightly red, and when he nodded to her as she stepped inside, there was something warm in his gaze she hadn't seen in all this time. He'd never admit it, and Phoebe would never ask. Music began softly from a small speaker in the corner, and the door opened. Zoe walked in, 4.5 years old, wearing a pale pink dress, white shoes, and brown hair braided into 2 perfect plaits. That morning she'd helped braid it herself, sitting in front of the mirror, handing Phoebe each section of hair and saying, with the seriousness of a child performing the most important task of her life, "You hold this part, Mom braids that part." Zoe carried a small basket of white rose petals, and she scattered them with extreme seriousness, step by step, petal by petal, unhurried, unsmiling, solemn as if this were a sacred ritual she'd rehearsed in front of the mirror for a week. Each petal was placed on the bakery tile floor with the precision a 4.5-year-old gives to what she values most. Guests smiled. Some chuckled softly at the adorable seriousness, but Zoe didn't notice. She reached the end of the aisle, stood before the flowered podium, and looked up at her father standing there, wearing a gray suit, not black, because Phoebe had said you don't wear black on your wedding day, and Elijah had listened. The first time in his life he'd changed the color of his suit for a woman. Zoe looked at her father and smiled. "Dad." One clear word rang through the small shop, and Elijah smiled, a smile he hadn't believed possible 6 months earlier. Phoebe walked in, wearing a simple white dress, no long train, no intricate lace, just a well-fitted white dress. Aunt Janet had sewn by hand, her hair loose, holding a small bouquet, and on the apron she'd taken off before putting on the dress, there was still flour dust from baking for her own wedding that morning. She walked down the petal-strewn aisle, past Ruth. Her mother squeezed her hand for a second, then let go, eyes wet but smiling, and Phoebe stepped beside Elijah. The judge read the vows. Elijah and Phoebe exchanged rings, and when he said "I do," his voice was hoarse with emotion but steady, steadier than any order he'd ever given in his empire. Then came the special part, the part Phoebe and Elijah had asked the judge to include. The judge knelt in front of Zoe, an elderly man with silver hair and gold-rimmed glasses, kneeling on the bakery tile floor, and asked in a formal but warm voice, "Zoe, do you accept Phoebe as your mother and allow her to braid your hair forever?" Zoe looked at the judge, then at Phoebe, then at her father, then back at the judge. "Yes." Then she raised one finger, paused dramatically, her large brown eyes so serious the whole shop held its breath. "But I only promise to eat almost all my vegetables." The whole bakery laughed. Ruth laughed until tears ran down her face. Dorothy laughed. The first real laugh Phoebe had ever seen from her. Not a polite social smile, but an unrestrained one. Brennan turned his face toward the door, his shoulders shaking slightly. Phoebe knelt in front of Zoe, took both of her hands, and looked into the brown eyes she'd loved since the first day in the cold mansion living room. "You promise to tell Mom when you're sad or angry, okay? Don't hide it. Don't keep it inside." Zoe nodded seriously. "Promise." Like the doctor taught. "If I'm sad, I say sad. If I'm angry, I say angry. I don't have to be good for grown-ups to stay." Words learned in therapy, but spoken with trust. The voice of a child who'd been through hell and learned emotions weren't something to hide. Phoebe smiled. "So we're officially a family now." Zoe tilted her head, thought for a moment, then shook it. "We've been a family for a long time. This just makes it more official." Then Zoe reached into the pocket of her pink dress and pulled out a plastic key, not the old yellow one she'd thrown away that night. This one was pink, new, shiny. One she'd asked Aunt Janet to buy just for her, hidden in her pocket for a week waiting for today. Zoe pressed the key into Phoebe's hand, her small fingers placing the light plastic into the palm rough from kneading dough. It's the key to my room. Mom doesn't have to knock. Anytime. Phoebe closed her fingers around the plastic key, and this time she knew it would never be thrown away again. The wedding celebration at Lawson's Bakery lasted into the afternoon, June sunlight pouring through the front windows and laying a warm, golden glow across the old wooden tables. The guest list was small, just Aunt Janet, a few of Phoebe's old friends, a handful of Elijah's closest associates, Zoe's therapist, and the people who truly mattered seated in the front row, Ruth in her wheelchair, Dorothy beside her, Brennan standing guard at the door but looking inward more than outward. The little shop felt warm and intimate, the faint scent of cookies still drifting from the oven Phoebe had forgotten to turn off that morning, and no one complained because that smell was the smell of this family. Zoe ran all over the bakery in her pink dress, her 2 braids bouncing with every step, until she stopped in front of Aunt Janet and held up a drawing she'd hidden in the pocket of her dress since morning. "Aunt Janet, look, it was a new drawing. 4 stick figures holding hands. The tallest figure on the left had no hair. That was Dad. The figure on the right had long brown hair. That was Mom Phoebe. The small figure in the middle with 2 braids was Zoe. And the 4th figure, smaller than Zoe, stood beside them, with short hair and clothes that weren't clear because it was colored in with a jumble of bright shades." Aunt Janet frowned and smiled at the same time. "Who's the 4th one, sweetheart?" Zoe looked at the picture, tilted her head, serious. "A little brother or sister. I don't know yet, but there will be one." Then she ran off to show someone else, leaving Aunt Janet laughing until tears streamed down her face, and Elijah and Phoebe looking at each other across the bakery, stunned, then laughing, then both of their eyes filling with tears, because that drawing had traveled a long way, from 2 stick figures in the corner of a preschool classroom to 3 stick figures with a woman in a purple dress and red shoes Zoe once dreamed of, to a torn drawing of 3 figures on the night of separation, and now to 4 stick figures holding hands, more than the little girl had ever dared to hope for. Then Zoe disappeared into the kitchen and came back carrying a small plate, walking carefully, her tongue sticking out in concentration. On the plate was a misshapen, sugary token of love, crooked, the icing slanted, thick on one side and thin on the other, powdered sugar uneven, the heart tilting to the right because the cutter had slipped when she pressed it down. Ugly, and the most beautiful cookie Phoebe had ever seen in her life. "I made it for you, Mom." Zoe held the plate out with both hands, eyes shining with pride. "I secretly asked Aunt Janet to teach me. I kneaded the dough myself, cut it myself, iced it myself, just like the first one you made for me when we first met." Phoebe took the cookie and she cried. She didn't hide it, didn't turn away, didn't bite her lip the way she always did. She stood in the middle of her mother's bakery, in her white wedding dress, holding a misshapen cookie her daughter had made with her own hands. And she cried in front of everyone, because that cookie was a circle completed, an answer to every question, proof that the love she'd poured into this child had bloomed and returned to her in the form of the ugliest and most beautiful heart-shaped cookie in the world. That night, after the guests left, after Aunt Janet cleaned the shop, after Brennan drove the family back to the Lincoln Park mansion, the 3 of them lay on the large bed in the master bedroom. Zoe was in the middle, as always, her head on a soft pillow, her hair still neatly braided, her left hand holding her father's hand, her right hand holding her mother's. The room was quiet, filled only with their steady breathing and the soft wind outside the window. "Phoebe," Zoe's voice was small in the dark. "Yes, sweetheart. Before, I was scared you'd be gone in the morning. Every night when I closed my eyes, I was scared. I was scared that if I slept, when I opened my eyes, you'd disappear. So I stayed awake a lot, kept opening my eyes to check, had lots of nightmares." Silence. "I'm not scared anymore." Phoebe squeezed her daughter's hand gently. Then Zoe spoke, calmly, softly, as naturally as breathing, without hesitation, without asking again, without adding, "Will you promise, or will you stay, or any conditions at all?" "I love you, Mom." Mom, not Miss Phoebe, not Auntie, Mom. One word this 4.5-year-old child had spent 3.5 years searching for, 10 days of happiness, and 14 days of hell, and 6 months of therapy, and thousands of tears, to finally say without fear that the person hearing it would disappear. "I love you too. Forever. Mom, you promise." "I promise." Zoe closed her eyes. Slept. No thumb sucking, No hugging a stuffed animal because the stuffed animal had been placed on the shelf a week earlier. Zoe had said the teddy can sleep on the shelf now. I have Mom. No nightmares. Just the peaceful sleep of a child who had finally found home. Ruth passed away 4 months after the wedding, on a quiet autumn afternoon, gentle and calm, just like the way she lived. Phoebe sat by her mother's bed as she closed her eyes, holding her hand, and the last words Ruth spoke were, "I'm proud of you, my daughter." That night Phoebe cried in Elijah's arms, cried all night, cried until there were no tears left, and he held her, said nothing, offered no words of comfort, only held her, because he knew there was pain words couldn't reach. The next morning, as Phoebe lay curled on the bed, eyes swollen, exhausted, the bedroom door opened. Zoe walked in quietly, climbed onto the bed, lay down beside Phoebe, and wrapped her small arms around her mother. "Mom, you're not alone. I'm here." And Phoebe held her daughter, cried into her hair, the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo, and she understood. Ruth had been right. Her mother pushed her toward Zoe not because she didn't need her daughter, but because she knew, with the wisdom of a mother preparing to leave, that love isn't holding on. Love is giving, letting go so the one you love can fly to where they need to be, no matter how much it hurts to release them. When people ask how they met, Elijah and Phoebe tell the truth. They start with the desperate lie of a mafia boss, kneeling in a bakery at 10 o'clock at night, holding an envelope of cash, asking a baker to pretend to be his wife for 2 weeks. But they end with the truest thing they've ever known. Love you choose every day, fight to keep, and promise never to let go. Because family isn't something you're born with. Family is something you build with messy mornings cracking eggs, with nights holding a child through nightmares, with crooked heart-shaped cookies, and with a plastic key a 4-year-old presses into your hand and says, "Mom doesn't have to knock, anytime." This story teaches us that real love is never easy. It demands courage, demands that you step through fear, endure pain, give without certainty you'll receive anything back. But when you choose love, when you choose to stay even when the world tells you to run, when you choose a child who isn't your blood but is your heart, miracles happen. Not fairy tale miracles, but real-life miracles. The miracle of an ugly cookie a daughter makes for her mother. The miracle of the words, "I love you," Mom spoken for the first time without fear. If Zoe's words tightened your chest, please tap the like button below this video, because every child in this world deserves to be loved, and every like is a way to spread that message. Share this story with someone you love, with someone exhausted by life, with someone wondering if love is real, so they can know that love is a daily choice. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories every day, because we promise the next story will touch your heart even more deeply. We'd love to hear from you. How did the story of Elijah, Phoebe, and Zoe make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in your real life? Have you ever loved someone knowing it would hurt? Write in the comments below and share what's in your heart, because every comment you leave is a powerful source of motivation that helps us continue telling more beautiful stories. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days spent beside the ones you love. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.